Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. The Dursleys, characters many people view solely as cruel and heartless. Harry spent his childhood in an atmosphere of coldness and suppression, but if you look closer, you'll notice that their behavior is full of contradictions and oddities. At times, it feels like there's something deeper behind their rough exterior, something more complex. Today, we're going to explore 6 surprising moments that might just make you see the Dursley family in a completely new light. Enjoy watching! Number 1. Why didn't they want Harry to leave? On the surface, the Dursleys make it painfully clear that they don't want Harry around. He sleeps in a cupboard, is given less food, constantly humiliated. It's like they're merely tolerating him. So why, when the chance finally comes to send him away to a school for wizards, do they fight it with everything they've got? This behavior seems completely illogical. Harry could have gone off, started a new life, and the Dursleys could have gone back to their perfect routine. No magic, no Lily, no reminders. Yet instead they lock him up, hide the letters, and even flee to a remote island just to keep him from getting to Hogwarts. Is it really just fear of the unknown, or were they terrified that once Harry discovered his power, he'd come back and make them regret everything? Number 2. Why did they lock Harry up? After the disastrous dinner with the client and the never-ending flood of owl-delivered letters, Vernon completely loses control. He locks Harry in his room, bolts the door, puts bars on the windows, as if the boy might fly away or walk through walls. But didn't he realize this was a wizard they were dealing with? Hogwarts was already waiting for Harry Potter, and his absence from Platform 934 would be noticed immediately. In his desperate attempt to control everything, Vernon acts more like a man in panic than a rational adult. His actions aren't just pointless, they're dangerous. He risked provoking much more serious consequences from the magical world. Number 3. Why did the Dursleys run away? As the mail bombardment escalates, Vernon makes a desperate move. He takes the whole family to a deserted island in the middle of a storm. No proper heating, no food. But for what? Surely he knew this wasn't a solution, just a delay. You can't hide from magic forever. This escape speaks less to a desire to protect the family and more to a total breakdown in logic and control. Magic had entered their lives, and the more they tried to shut it out, the louder it knocked, or came crashing through the roof. Number 4. Why were they so shocked by the letters? The letter scene is one of the most iconic moments in the first book. Harry can't get a single envelope, and Vernon spirals further into madness with each new attempt. But what's truly strange is their reaction. Why was this even a surprise? Petunia knew about the wizarding world. She even wrote a letter to Dumbledore as a child, begging to be accepted into Hogwarts. So she had to know that Harry would be invited, and Vernon, it seems, had some idea as well, even if not in detail. So why the shock? Why the sense that something outrageous was happening when it was entirely predictable? Number 5. Harry and the cupboard. The symbol of neglect and cruelty, and of course, is the cupboard under the stairs. Harry wasn't just denied a room. He was literally stuffed into the darkness. It's as if they did everything possible to ensure he didn't feel like part of the family. But wasn't that a bit too much? What would they do if guests came over? Lock him in? Move him somewhere else? It raises a lot of questions and creates unnecessary risks. It would have been easier to put him in a small bedroom and pretend he was just an ordinary nephew. That would have looked more respectable and aligned with their obsession with appearances. So maybe the cupboard wasn't just for convenience. Maybe it was symbolic punishment, a constant reminder to him and to themselves of who he was and why he didn't belong. Number 6. Dudley and the tail. When Hagrid literally turns Dudley into a pig, it's one of the few times the Dursleys face magic up close. But why didn't they do anything about it? According to Hagrid, the tail didn't vanish on its own. It had to be removed surgically. What did they tell the doctors? Didn't the hospital ask questions? And why didn't Petunia, who knew at least something about the wizarding world, take it further. This was a clear opportunity to file a complaint, demand compensation, or at the very least get someone punished. Which brings us back to the same question. Could it be that the Dursleys were more afraid of the magical world than they were hateful toward Harry? Maybe it was fear, not malice, that drove them to do such absurd and irrational things. Number 7, why didn't they complain to neighbours? The Dursleys lived for appearances. Number 4, Privet Drive was their kingdom of curtains, trimmed hedges, and polite smiles. Yet when it came to Harry, they chose silence. Not even a fake story for the neighbours, no whispers about a troubled boy we took in or poor child with issues. Nothing. In Philosopher's Stone, Mrs. Fig breaks her leg, and Harry is dragged along to the zoo because there's no one else to watch him. And everyone on the street is surprised to see him at all. That's how rare it was for him to leave the house. They didn't explain him. They erased him. It backfired. Every slammed door, every glimpse of Harry in oversized clothes, every sharp glance from Petunia. It all built curiosity. People notice what's hidden. If the Dursleys had spun a careful tale, they could have controlled the narrative. Instead, their silence turned into gossip. Strange things followed Harry. The neighbours saw, heard, wondered, and the more the Dursleys denied, the louder the questions became. For a family obsessed with looking normal, they made the most suspicious choices possible. Number 8. Dudley's birthday and the gift logic. On Dudley's 11th birthday, he stormed into the kitchen and counted his presents. 36. He frowned. Last year I had 37. Petunia froze. Vernon's moustache twitched. Instead of laughing it off or offering a gentle lesson, they promised to buy 2 more. Immediately. No hesitation. No discussion about being grateful. No mention of how most children would be thrilled with half that number. Just blind panic to please their son, or rather, to avoid his tantrum. It made no sense. The Dursleys prided themselves on being the model family. Polished, respectable, proper. But indulging Dudley's every whim only exposed the cracks. They taught him greed, not gratitude. And they did it proudly. Meanwhile, Harry stood to the side watching it all. No gifts, no cake, just the lesson that loudness got rewards and silence got nothing. For people obsessed with appearances, the Dursleys didn't realize they were raising a boy who would one day punch a wall over a television channel. And they called Harry the problem. Number 9, their irrational fear of Harry. Harry never threatened them. He never raised his voice or waved a wand at them, not even when he got one. He stayed quiet, obedient, often scared, and still the Dursleys looked at him like a ticking bomb. In Philosopher's Stone, after Hagrid bursts in, Vernon cries, "I will not pay to have some crackpot old fool teach him magic tricks." But what was he so afraid of? Up to that point, Harry had done nothing except survive. He hadn't hexed Dudley. He hadn't used accidental magic in violence. The worst he'd done was grow his hair back and escape a beating at school by unknowingly teleporting to a roof. If they'd treated him like a regular, even weird, child, things might have been different. But their fear was never about Harry. It was about what he represented. Petunia flinched at the very idea of magic, not at the boy himself. They let that fear control them. They locked the cat flap, installed bars on the windows, and stuffed him back into the smallest spaces, hoping it would smother whatever strange force he carried. But it only made Harry stronger. The more they tried to bury the truth, the more it bloomed, quiet and bright, inside him. Number 10, ignoring the benefits of magic. Vernon Dursley worked in drills. He valued efficiency, routine, and anything that kept his world neat and profitable. And yet, he never once looked at Harry and the boy who could vanish glass, talk to snakes, and grow his hair back overnight, and thought maybe this could be useful. They had a literal wizard under their roof, and instead of seeing opportunity, they saw only threat. In Chamber of Secrets, when Harry mentions that he's not allowed to use magic outside school, Vernon's reaction isn't relief, it's glee. He grins, because he knows Harry can't fight back. Imagine the possibilities. Petunia could have asked for help with housework. Vernon could have tried to gain inside information about magical inventions or even just sold bizarre magical trinkets on the side. Even Dudley, if raised differently, might have found excitement in magical toys or books. Instead, the Dursleys chose to struggle through the mundane, cleaning gutters, fixing light bulbs, hauling groceries, while pretending none of it could be done with a flick of a wand. Their hatred blinded them to basic advantage. In fact, their rejection of magic often created more problems than it solved. They sent Harry to fetch the mail in storms, scrub the floors by hand, and cook full breakfasts before school, all while knowing he had abilities they refused to acknowledge. It wasn't just unkind, it was impractical. They were so determined to suppress what made Harry different, they lost every chance to make their own lives easier. And that's what made their prejudice truly self-destructive. Number 11. Not telling Harry the truth about his parents. Harry grew up believing his parents had died in a car crash. That's the story Vernon and Petunia fed him. Cold, simple, a lie. Petunia, who had known Lily all her life, never once looked Harry in the eye and said her sister's name with love or sorrow. She spoke of her with bitterness, or if she spoke at all. But the silence was louder than hate. In Philosopher's Stone, when Hagrid tells Harry the truth, that James and Lily were murdered by Voldemort, Harry whispers, "Killed? But I thought, you said they died in a car crash." And Petunia doesn't deny it. She scowls. They could have told him. Not the magic, not the prophecy, but the love. They could have said Lily died protecting him, that she was brave, that she chose her world, that his father stood with her. But instead they erased his parents from existence, locked away every photograph, hid every memory, and by doing so they didn't protect Harry from the truth. They sharpened his need for it. Every question they refused to answer turned into hunger. Every lie made magic shine brighter when it finally arrived. It's ironic. The Dursleys wanted Harry to be normal, to forget where he came from, but their silence had the opposite effect. The mystery made the truth irresistible. By burying the story of James and Lily, they handed Harry a shovel. And when Hagrid appeared on that stormy island, Harry didn't hesitate. He followed the giant into the unknown without a second thought, because the Dursleys left him nothing to stay for, and everything to discover. Number 12. Strange attitude toward Dumbledore's warnings. Albus Dumbledore wasn't just a name in a letter. He was the man who defeated Grindelwald, the one you-know-who feared. And yet the Dursleys treated his warning as if it were a polite suggestion. When Dumbledore left Harry on their doorstep with a letter explaining the blood protection charm, they obeyed, but just barely. They raised him, yes, but more like a prisoner than a child. They ignored the unspoken threat behind Dumbledore's words. You must raise him as your own, or the protection will fail. What makes their behavior even stranger is that they knew that Dumbledore could show up at any moment. And he did. In Half-Blood Prince, he arrives at their house, calm but terrifying. He sits them down, offers them mead, then, with a flick of his wand, forces them to drink when they refuse out of spite. That alone should have reminded them who they were dealing with. But instead of showing fear or respect, Vernon tries to outstare him. Petunia purses her lips. They act as if Dumbledore is just another headmaster, not the most powerful wizard alive. Dumbledore even says it directly. You did not do as I asked. You have never treated Harry as a son. He speaks quietly, but every word is heavy. And still the Dursleys don't change. They don't apologize. They don't ask for forgiveness or try to make things right. They continue their cold routine as if nothing matters beyond their spotless living room and Dudley's meals. It's almost as if they believe the magical world won't really intervene, that the letter on the doorstep was the beginning and end of it. But that was a dangerous bet. They had a child under their roof who was essential to a war they barely understood. They were given a warning by a man who could bend reality with a flick of his wand. And yet instead of keeping their heads down, they pushed boundaries, insulted the boy, humiliated him, mocked the very world that protected them. For people so desperate to avoid trouble, the Dursleys walked on the edge of disaster with their eyes closed. Number 13. Why didn't they fear Harry's revenge? Petunia Dursley had seen magic before. She remembered how her sister, Lily, could make flowers bloom with a flick of her wand. She had watched her parents beam with pride while she stood in the shadows, ignored. And yet even with that memory, with the full knowledge that Harry had inherited the same power, she and her husband never showed a flicker of fear that the boy might turn that power against them one day. They locked him in a cupboard. They starved him. They shouted at him for existing. But never once did they ask what happens when he grows up. It's not as if Harry was hiding his abilities. As he got older, strange things happened around him. His hair grew back overnight after a terrible haircut. He leapt onto a school roof during a chase. One time, when Dudley and his gang tried to corner him, the glass of a snake tank at the zoo disappeared, and Dudley ended up in the water. Petunia and Vernon saw these signs. They punished him, they scolded him, but they never seemed to grasp the truth that the small, skinny boy they hated would one day hold a wand and know how to use it. If the Dursleys had been logical, they might have played it safe. Treated Harry with the bare minimum of respect, built some sort of shaky alliance to avoid his wrath when he came of age. But instead they poured fuel on the fire. They made an enemy out of a boy who could speak to snakes, summon light from thin air, and later, stand face to face with Voldemort himself. And they did it with a smug certainty that he'd never turn on them. Why? Because they underestimated magic. Worse, they underestimated Harry. Number 14. Why didn't Petunia use Harry to get closer to magic? Petunia Evans had once dreamed in secret. Long before she became Petunia Dursley of Privet Drive, long before she devoted her life to polished kitchen counters and the dull rhythm of suburban routine, she had allowed herself a fragile hope to be part of her sister's world. She watched Lily float leaves with her fingertips, saw her talk to wildflowers and whisper with creatures no one else believed in. While their parents marveled at Lily's talent, Petunia's admiration curdled into something sharper. It wasn't hatred, not at first. It was longing, raw and deeply buried. Her letter to Albus Dumbledore, begging to attend Hogwarts, was not the act of a petty child, but of one whose heart cracked with envy and awe. The letter was returned, politely worded, firm. Her world, he explained, was not hers to enter. That reply sealed something inside her. Her yearning for magic was never extinguished, only buried under layers of resentment, social conformity, and bitterness. When Lily died and Harry was left on her doorstep, eyes like Lily's, hair like James's, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of smoke and magic, she did not see an opportunity. She saw a ghost. It is a strange thing, then, that Petunia never tried to exploit the connection. A woman who once hungered for even a glimpse into the magical realm had that realm drop, quite literally, on her doorstep. Harry was not just a wizard, he was the wizard. The boy who lived. From the moment she read Dumbledore's letter in 1981, Petunia knew what he was. She knew there would be letters and owls and strange people in robes, yet she never tried to ask questions, never attempted to use him to peer beyond the veil that had once so cruelly shut her out. Perhaps it is because Harry reminded her too painfully of the dream denied. Every flicker of his magic, unintentional bursts that broke glass or grew his hair overnight, was not a reminder of what she could gain, but of what she had lost. Vernon, of course, made no secret of his disgust for magic, but it was Petunia who took the lead in shaping Harry's miserable life. It was she who insisted he sleep in the cupboard, she who snatched letters from owls, and she who shivered every time he uttered the word Hogwarts. And yet, if she had wanted, Petunia could have asked. Harry knew little at first, but by his second or third year he had stories, he had names: Dumbledore, Hagrid, Sirius Black, Remus Lupin, names that had weight and legend behind them. Petunia could have asked about them under the cover of civility, feigned indifference while extracting details. She might have tracked news of the magical world through Harry's letters or overheard his conversations with Ron or Hermione, but she never did. What's more, Petunia's access to the wizarding world was unparalleled for a Muggle. She was the legal guardian of the most famous magical child in Britain. The Ministry of Magic knew her name. Albus Dumbledore had written to her personally. Arabella Figg, a squib planted nearby, kept watch on her home. Had Petunia wanted to, she could have walked into Diagon Alley with Harry by her side and been welcomed, reluctantly perhaps, but welcomed all the same. She had proximity to a world most Muggles would never even dream of, and she turned her back on it. Why? Part of the answer may lie in the way grief and bitterness reshape a soul. Petunia did not merely lose her sister, she lost her to a world that chose Lily and rejected her. When Voldemort killed Lily and James, Petunia was not merely gaining a nephew. She was inheriting a reminder of everything she had once yearned for and failed to reach. To embrace Harry's magic, even indirectly, would be to reopen that wound, to admit that magic still held power over her. And so she chose denial. It was easier to sneer at it all, easier to call it nonsense, to speak of those people in contemptuous tones. "My sister being what she was," she once said to Harry, "she got herself blown up and we got landed with you." It was not just cruelty, it was a defense mechanism. To acknowledge magic as real and wondrous would be to accept her own exclusion. And Petunia had built an entire identity around normalcy, around being the opposite of Lily. Yet even so, the instinct to reach toward magic flickered at moments. When the first Hogwarts letter arrived, she could have torn it up without reading. Instead, she hid it. When the second came and the third, she panicked, not only at the threat of Harry leaving, but perhaps at the threat of being pulled into that world herself. The letters were addressed with eerie precision. The cupboard under the stairs. Magic was watching her. Magic knew she was not ready to face it. Years later, when Harry was 17 and about to leave forever, Petunia stood at the door, struggling with her words. "You didn't just lose a mother that night in Godric's Hollow, you know," J.K. Rowling once said of that moment. Petunia lost her sister. She might have said it, but she didn't. The bitterness ran too deep. Even then, with everything ending, she could not let her guard down. Her pride and pain won out over curiosity. Another reason Petunia may have avoided engaging with Harry's world was fear. She had seen firsthand what magic could do, the sudden disappearances, the unnatural events. She had seen her sister, radiant and strange, walk away from their family into a realm of danger and mystery. She knew that Voldemort had killed Lily and James. She likely feared the implications of magic, saw it not as wonder but as threat. When Dumbledore left Harry with the Dursleys, he said only that it was for protection. He did not explain the blood charm, did not reassure them. Petunia was left to raise a boy she did not understand, whose very existence came with risks. Number 15, their odd attitude toward Harry's school performance. When the Dursleys locked Harry Potter into the cupboard under the stairs, they weren't merely hiding a boy, they were burying something far more uncomfortable for them, proof that their carefully constructed world was built on denial, fear, and contradiction. Among the strangest of the Dursleys' many illogical behaviors lies a quietly powerful mystery, their deliberate refusal to acknowledge or take pride in Harry's academic capabilities, especially during his years in Muggle school. At first glance, it may seem like just another layer of their cruelty, but on closer inspection, this choice reveals a twisted logic, fueled not by reason, but by insecurity and a need for control. Harry was not a poor student. The books make this subtly clear. While not academically obsessive like Hermione or even particularly driven, Harry was alert, capable, and clever. He could think quickly under pressure, solve problems with little information, and had an intuitive grasp of right and wrong, all markers of a sharp mind. Yet the Dursleys treated him as if he were a hopeless case. Aunt Petunia, obsessed with cleanliness and appearances, seemed oddly unbothered by the idea of her nephew being perceived as unintelligent. Vernon Dursley, who wanted to be seen as the image of respectable fatherhood, made no effort to claim credit for any of Harry's better traits, even if doing so would bolster his own reputation. What makes this even more bizarre is the Dursleys' obsession with appearances. They were terrified of what the neighbours thought. Number 7, Miss Figg, the postman, the milkman. Every passing glance from the outside world was, in the Dursleys' minds, an inspection of their private perfection. Dudley was paraded as a shining example of a strong, healthy, and, at least according to them, gifted child. His birthday was a public event. His school photographs were proudly displayed. His every tantrum was excused with phrases like, "He's just high-spirited," or "He's a boy with a lot of energy." But Harry? He was hidden away, not just physically, but symbolically. The cupboard wasn't only a place of confinement, it was a metaphor for the way they tried to erase any light he might cast on their carefully shaded lives. This contradiction is not subtle. In Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, we read, Harry was used to spiders because the cupboard under the stairs was full of them, and that was where he slept. But when we examine his school years at the local primary school, details emerge. Harry wore Dudley's old uniforms hung off his small frame like curtains. He came to school with glasses taped in the middle and a lightning scar that inspired whispers. Still, there's no mention of him struggling in lessons. He wasn't mocked by teachers for lack of academic talent. Instead, what drew attention was something else entirely, his unexplained ability to make strange things happen. Why then didn't the Dursleys pivot? Why didn't they point to Harry's school reports as proof of their good parenting? Wouldn't it have served their vanity to have teachers compliment their guardianship? If Petunia had proudly told Mrs. Number 9 that our Harry got top marks in English, or he's quite gifted in maths, wouldn't that have furthered the illusion of their perfect home? The answer lies in the very foundation of their fear. To praise Harry, to acknowledge his intelligence or talents in any way, would be to admit that he wasn't the burden they told themselves he was. Worse, it would be to admit that Lily, Petunia's sister, might have passed something admirable on to her son. This is where the denial becomes generational. Petunia didn't just hate Harry's magical heritage, she resented Lily's existence. Lily had been the shining daughter, plucked from obscurity by Hogwarts and transformed into someone Petunia could never be. For Petunia, Lily's intelligence, kindness, and magic had all been humiliations. And Harry? He was the walking echo of all of it. So rather than reclaim Harry as a success story, they buried him deeper. At school, they downplayed any praise he might have received. They fed teachers lies about his supposed issues, priming them to see him as odd, troublesome, or forgettable. They built an identity for Harry that was convenient for them, an identity of failure. Not because he failed, but because admitting he succeeded would unravel the entire story they told themselves. Dudley's contrasting treatment serves as the mirror image of this. In Philosopher's Stone it is noted, Dudley had a large pink face, not much neck, small watery blue eyes, and thick blonde hair that lay smoothly on his thick, fat head. He was pampered, overfed, and overpraised. Yet Dudley was objectively lazy, unintelligent, and often violent. He had no redeeming academic qualities, and even his school Smeltings is presented as more of a status badge than a place of learning. Still, the Dursleys shouted his achievements from the rooftops. They would beam if Dudley brought home a participation ribbon. They glorified mediocrity in him while dismissing potential in Harry. The Dursleys' logic was not built on reality. It was built on emotional survival. By keeping Harry small, by insisting he was odd, failing, and strange, they could keep their worldview intact. If they praised him, if they allowed his light to shine even a little, the shadow would fall on Dudley. Worse still, it might shine back on Petunia's bitter envy of her sister. And Vernon, who despised all things unexplainable, would be forced to reckon with the fact that Harry, the boy he wished didn't exist, was better than his own son in ways that mattered. Number 16. Why did they allow him to go to the Quidditch World Cup? It seemed almost too easy. For a boy who had spent most of his summers locked in a cupboard, who had to beg for scraps of affection and barter for permission to leave the house, Harry's sudden freedom at the beginning of his 4th year came with a surprising lack of resistance. One would expect that Vernon Dursley, a man who flinched at the word wizard, would never consent to letting his nephew disappear for days in the company of an entire magical family, and yet in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, Harry is not only permitted but practically handed over to the Weasleys with no fight, no bitter ultimatum, no tantrum about magic contaminating their pristine Muggle household. The Dursleys, so famously stubborn, relented. But why? The moment is subtle in the book, embedded within a comedic scene where the Weasleys come to pick Harry up through the fireplace. The Dursleys, horrified by the magical intrusion, are overwhelmed by the eccentric chaos the Weasley twins bring into their living room. Yet, even after Fred accidentally drops a Tum-Tum toffee that causes Dudley to sprout a foot-long tongue, Vernon does not demand that Harry stay. He simply lets him go. For those who have followed Harry's life at Privet Drive, this moment stands out as not only uncharacteristic, but deeply suspicious. After years of abusive neglect, why would they now, of all times, yield so easily? To answer this, we must rewind to the summer preceding the invitation. Harry had just returned from a harrowing encounter with the Dementors during his 3rd year, an experience that left an indelible mark on his psyche. He was older, more hardened, and significantly less tolerant of the Dursleys' mistreatment. More importantly, he had leverage. In Prisoner of Azkaban, Harry discovers the truth about Sirius Black, his godfather, falsely accused, now free and watching over him. The Dursleys, though unaware of the magical specifics, are told that Harry has a powerful godfather who would not take kindly to mistreatment. Harry uses this knowledge like a shield. He's a convicted murderer, but he's my godfather, Harry tells Vernon in the previous book. The unspoken threat lingers in the room like smoke. The Dursleys, who had always believed they could mistreat Harry with impunity, were suddenly made to realize that he had powerful protectors. For once, they were afraid. By the time summer rolls around again, that fear has settled into quiet compliance. Vernon knows that saying no to Harry's trip could invite attention from wizards, from the Weasleys, and, most importantly, from Sirius Black. The Dursleys loathe attention, particularly magical attention. They have spent years constructing a perfectly dull life, one without surprises or complications, and the idea that an enraged wizard godfather might show up on their lawn is enough to make them yield. In many ways, it isn't kindness or understanding that prompts them to agree. It's fear disguised as politeness. But fear alone doesn't account for the lack of argument. In past years, the Dursleys have reacted with violent protest to even the smallest magical request. What changed? Perhaps the answer lies in the shifting dynamic within the Dursley household itself. Dudley, their darling son, had been traumatized. After Fred and George's joke with the Tum-Tum toffee, Dudley was left gagging on an ever-growing tongue that had to be magically removed. While we as readers may smirk at the scene, it's not hard to imagine how the Dursleys perceived it as a warning. The magical world wasn't just full of oddities, it was dangerous, unpredictable, and disturbingly close. Mrs. Weasley, though kind and motherly, was also assertive and unapologetic. She stormed into the Dursleys' home, demanded to speak to Harry, and glared daggers at Vernon when he refused to answer her. Arthur Weasley, though bumbling and curious, exuded quiet confidence. Their mere presence was enough to turn the Dursleys' carefully curated suburban control into ash. After that, letting Harry go wasn't a loss, it was a retreat. The invitation to the Quidditch World Cup itself served another purpose. It provided the Dursleys with a means to remove Harry from their lives temporarily without having to directly deal with him. He would be gone, perhaps for days, and they wouldn't have to think about him or acknowledge his birthday, which, unsurprisingly, they had once again ignored. For them, this was an unexpected reprieve. They didn't need to prepare extra meals or watch him sulk in the corner. No cupboard, no sarcastic remarks, no owl droppings. Just a quiet house and their son, hopefully tongue shrinked and recovering. Additionally, the Dursleys had become aware that Harry's life at Hogwarts, while magical, was also dangerous. Each year he returned with a new scar, a new story, and a new layer of trauma. While they didn't understand the particulars, they knew he wasn't exaggerating. At some point, even they had to recognize that he was surviving things no ordinary child should face. Their coldness may have remained, but their understanding of Harry's reality had shifted, if only slightly. Letting him go to the Quidditch World Cup may have felt less like indulgence and more like inevitability. Another key factor is the social standing of the Weasleys in the wizarding world. Though poor by magical standards, the Weasleys represented a kind of magical aristocracy in the eyes of Muggles. Arthur worked at the Ministry of Magic. Their children attended the best wizarding school in the world. They were not unknowns or rogues, in contrast to Sirius Black, whose name alone was synonymous with danger, the Weasleys were safe, respectable, even endearingly ordinary in their eccentricity. For the Dursleys, this mattered. If they had to entrust Harry to magical folk, it was better he went with an official-looking family than some dark wizard hiding in the shadows. Number 17. Why didn't they confront Dumbledore directly? From the moment Albus Dumbledore left Harry Potter on the doorstep of Number 4, Privet Drive, the Dursleys' world shifted. It was a decision made without warning, consultation, or consent. A single letter pinned to a blanket explained it all, or rather, explained nothing. Petunia Dursley, who had distanced herself from the magical world long ago, was suddenly forced to confront it in the most tangible form possible, a crying infant tied by blood to a sister she had tried to forget. Vernon Dursley, a man obsessed with order and normalcy, was forced to welcome into his rigid household a child linked to chaos and danger. And yet, despite the radical upheaval Dumbledore imposed on their lives, they never once sought him out to protest, confront, or even ask questions. They simply accepted. Their acceptance, however, wasn't born from peace or understanding. It festered into bitter resentment that they internalized and redirected toward Harry. Their treatment of him over the years bordered on emotional cruelty, locking him in cupboards, withholding food, dismissing his humanity. But never did they challenge the root of their anger. Dumbledore remained, to them, a distant shadow, untouchable and unquestionable. It is this silence, this lack of confrontation, that demands examination. The Dursleys had no shortage of opportunities to voice their frustrations. When Hagrid burst through the door of the hut on the rock on Harry's 11th birthday, it was the first time they were forced into direct contact with the magical world since Lily's death. Petunia, trembling with a lifetime of suppressed emotions, did speak briefly about her sister. She admitted knowing more than she ever let on. My dratted sister being what she was. I was the only one who saw her for what she was, a freak. That outburst revealed the depth of her bitterness, but it wasn't directed at Dumbledore. Even then, the man who orchestrated their unwanted guardianship remained untouched. When the letters from Hogwarts began arriving in floods, Vernon reacted with increasing desperation. He went to great lengths to prevent Harry from reading them, spiraling into paranoia. He uprooted the entire family, dragging them from location to location in a futile attempt to escape magic. This behavior, absurd as it was, demonstrates how deeply he feared the magical world. Fear, perhaps, is the first answer to why he never challenged Dumbledore. It wasn't just that Dumbledore represented magic, it was that he represented ultimate magical authority. To Vernon, a man who viewed magic as an uncontrollable threat, Dumbledore was less a man and more a force of nature. Petunia, on the other hand, had a more complex relationship with Dumbledore. She had once written him a letter as a child, begging to be allowed into Hogwarts. His polite but firm refusal left a wound that never healed. That memory is implied in her actions, in her silences. When Harry receives his letter and Vernon questions how the school knows where Harry sleeps, Petunia snaps, "They're watching the house." This line, buried in the flurry of the moment, exposes her deep paranoia. She believes Dumbledore, or those under his command, are always watching. In her mind, confronting him might invite retaliation. It's not just fear of magic, it's fear of Dumbledore himself. He is a figure woven into whispered tales and family trauma, someone who appeared out of the past and dropped a child like a curse on their doorstep. In that sense, he is almost mythological to the Dursleys, especially to Petunia. His name alone is enough to end conversations. In Order of the Phoenix, when Dumbledore arrives at Privet Drive to deliver a stern warning about Harry's safety, Vernon Dursley doesn't even try to object. He listens, silent and pale, clearly intimidated. The scene shows us a man so out of his depth that protest seems laughable, but perhaps fear alone doesn't fully explain their silence. Pride must be considered. Vernon Dursley is a man whose pride is immense, yet it is also fragile. To acknowledge Dumbledore, to initiate contact, to even think of writing him a letter, would mean accepting that Dumbledore had power over them, that their lives were being dictated by a man they could neither understand nor influence. Instead of confronting that truth, Vernon chose to pretend it didn't exist. He reduced Harry to an inconvenience, framed him as a delinquent cousin rather than a magical orphan, and buried the reality of Dumbledore's presence under layers of willful ignorance. Petunia, too, clung to pride, though hers was tangled with guilt. She hated her sister, or at least convinced herself that she did, and accepting Harry was a way of punishing herself. She never protected Harry from Vernon or Dudley's cruelty, but she also never turned him out onto the streets. There was a line she would not cross. Was it her last tie to Lily? Or was it a fearful adherence to Dumbledore's unspoken command? One could argue it was both. Dumbledore, in his letter, had explained that Harry's safety depended on him living with blood relatives. While you can still call home the place where your mother's blood dwells, there he will be protected. It was magic Petunia didn't understand, but it was magic she dared not question. And so she obeyed, not because she was coerced, but because she was shackled by a cocktail of resentment, guilt, and fear. Had she challenged Dumbledore, what would she have said? That it was unfair, that she didn't want the boy, that she blamed him for her sister's death, her ruined Christmas dinners, and the eyes that looked so much like Lily's? She didn't need to say it. She lived it every day, silently, letting her bitterness leak into every glare, every neglected meal, every slammed door. Dumbledore, for his part, remained distant. He sent no owls, made no visits. His only real contact came when absolutely necessary. In Half-Blood Prince, he visits the Dursleys to collect Harry. The moment is telling. He chastises them for their cruelty, but he does so with calm disdain rather than anger. He is not surprised by their behavior. Perhaps he always knew what they were capable of. You did not do as I asked. You have never treated Harry as a son. The accusation is mild in tone, but devastating in content. Dumbledore speaks as if disappointed in them, not as if they were ever equals in the arrangement. That sense of imbalance is important. The Dursleys never saw themselves as equal participants in Harry's story. They saw themselves as unwilling custodians. Dumbledore was, in their minds, the storyteller, the author, the one pulling the strings. To argue with him would be like arguing with the author of a book. You could shout at the pages, but they wouldn't answer. That fatalism bled into everything they did. They never believed they had control, so they never tried to seize it. But perhaps the most revealing moment comes not from Dumbledore, but from Dudley. At the end of Order of the Phoenix, after Harry saves him from Dementors, something shifts in Dudley's perspective. In Deathly Hallows, as they prepare to go into hiding, Dudley hesitates. He tries to say something to Harry. I don't think you're a waste of space. It's awkward, clumsy, but genuine. Dudley is trying to atone in the only way he knows. Vernon and Petunia, however, remain silent. Their chance to confront the past passes them by again. There's a tragedy in that silence. The Dursleys are not characters known for introspection, but they are deeply shaped by their unspoken fears and regrets. If they had confronted Dumbledore, perhaps they would have confronted themselves. Instead, they lived in a house haunted not by ghosts, but by memories, of a sister lost, of a world denied, of a child they never truly saw as human. By the time Harry leaves Privet Drive for the last time, the damage is done. Dumbledore is dead. The war has begun. The Dursleys vanish into the Muggle protection program, still untouched by magic, still angry, still small. They are never punished, never redeemed. Their silence remains unbroken. Perhaps that is the cruelest magic of all, not a curse cast with a wand, but a life lived in fear of ever asking why. Ultimately, the Dursleys' failure to confront Dumbledore reveals more about themselves than about him. It shows us what happens when fear, pride, and bitterness collide. It reminds us that silence is not neutrality, it is surrender. And in the case of the Dursleys, it was a surrender so complete that they never even realized they had lost. Number 18. Why didn't they move away after signs of magic? Of all the curious inconsistencies in the lives of the Dursleys, none stands out as sharply as their strange refusal to flee from the magical presence growing under their roof. One might expect that the moment Harry James Potter began showing signs of unnatural behavior, vanishing from Bully's reach or growing his hair back overnight, his aunt and uncle would seize the opportunity to escape, to find some quiet village where no one had ever heard the name Potter. Yet they stayed. They stayed in the prim, predictable world of Privet Drive, stubbornly rooted in a place where their fears had nowhere to hide. To understand their motives, one must return to the essence of Vernon Dursley's worldview: order, routine, control. Vernon, the director of a company that made drills, was a man who measured success in neat hedges and full plates of bacon. The idea of moving, of disrupting the well-trimmed symmetry of his existence, would have been a profound threat. He did not wish to lose his standing in the neighborhood where Number 4 was known for its immaculate garden and precisely timed morning routines. To uproot all of that because of a child's nonsense would be tantamount to admitting that the nonsense was real. Petunia, for her part, lived in a different prison, one constructed from jealousy, shame, and a desperate yearning for normalcy. Her sister Lily had always been the extraordinary one, the beautiful witch who had swept into a world Petunia longed to understand but was never invited to join. After Lily's death, Petunia swore she would cleanse her life of that world. My sister being what she was, I was the only one who saw her for what she was, a freak, she once confessed bitterly. In Harry's strange episodes, she saw shadows of her sister, reminders of a world that had taken Lily away and left Petunia behind. When Harry's hair grew back overnight, after Petunia's attempt to cut it to a horrible haircut, it frightened her. But not in the way one might expect. It wasn't fear of magic that gripped her, but fear of recognition that blood runs deeper than wishes. She had tried to smother Lily's memory under years of silence and scrubbed floors, but Harry brought it back with every unexplained incident. And yet, even as the truth reared its head, she stayed. Because to run would be to acknowledge that there was something to run from. Vernon, when faced with magical incidents, responded with aggression, denial, and noise, the classic defense of a man who believed he could shout reality into submission. When Harry leapt to the school roof to escape Dudley's gang, Vernon insisted it was mischief. Jumped, that's what he did, jumped clear over the school kitchens. He refused to entertain the alternative. Had he packed up the family and left little whinging, it would have meant surrendering to something he could neither understand nor control. Moreover, both Dursleys were deeply invested in appearances. The neighbours, Mr. and Mrs. Nextdoor, the smiling postman, the gossiping woman at the corner shop, all saw the Dursleys as model citizens. If there was one thing Dursleys prided themselves on, it was being normal. Uprooting their lives without an explanation would have set tongues wagging, and that to the Dursleys was worse than any bout of accidental magic. They preferred to endure Harry's outbursts behind closed doors rather than expose themselves to the scandal of running away. There is also the question of pride. Vernon was not a man to admit defeat. The magical world had tried to worm its way into his home, first through Lily, then through letters that arrived in a flurry of owls and smoke. To pack up and move would be to concede that he had lost. Instead, he dug in his heels. He boarded up the mail slot, fled to an island on a rock, and still he resisted. "No more mail! I'm not having one more blasted letter in this house!" he barked, red-faced and trembling. Moving would have been an easier option, but Vernon preferred war to retreat. The Dursleys' stubbornness also lay in their desire to contain what they feared. If they could just keep Harry close, keep the magic buried under chores and cupboard doors, maybe it wouldn't grow. They locked him under the stairs, punished him for questions, and ensured he never had a moment alone to dream. Moving to another neighborhood might have given Harry space. New teachers, new friends, new places to explore. It might have let the magic grow. Better, they thought, to keep him under their thumb. There's an irony in their fear of discovery. By staying in one place, they risked exactly that. Harry's incidents, like making the glass disappear at the zoo, were becoming more difficult to explain, and yet they remained. It's as if they believed that Privet Drive itself was a fortress against change, a place where magic had no power. They knew that if anyone found out about the Potters, they'd be laughed at. But as the years passed and the signs became undeniable, they still chose their illusion over reality. Somewhere deep in Petunia's heart was a flicker of guilt. She knew the truth of Harry's parentage. She had received Dumbledore's letter with Harry on the doorstep. She knew what had happened, what her sister had died for. To run would be to abandon that promise. She never spoke of it, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of shame. But it weighed on her. She could not love Harry, not truly, but she would not leave him to strangers. In her own bitter, repressed way, staying was her act of penance. Their house, number 4, was more than bricks and mortar. It was their sanctuary, their battlefield, and their prison. Every corner whispered of compromise. Harry's cupboard was a reminder that he didn't belong. Dudley's second bedroom stood as a monument to their indulgence. They couldn't abandon all that. They couldn't admit that their way of life had failed. They would rather suffer its collapse one magical spark at a time. The fear of the unknown also played its part. Moving meant encountering new neighbors, new rules, new risks. What if Harry's magic became worse in unfamiliar surroundings? What if someone saw something they couldn't explain? At least on Privet Drive, they knew what to expect. They went as far as to put bars on Harry's window. They didn't trust the outside world, only the rigid, suffocating control of their own. Perhaps Vernon also believed that running would not help. After the letters began arriving in droves, despite every effort to stop them, he saw the relentlessness of the magical world. No matter how far they went, from car to hotel to rickety shack in the sea, the letters found them. It must have dawned on him that there was no escape. Magic would follow Harry, and thus would follow them. Their best hope was to stay put, and hope it stayed quiet. One cannot ignore the influence of Petunia's envy. She resented Lily's magic, but she had once written to Dumbledore herself, begging to be allowed into Hogwarts. Her rejection became a lifelong wound. In Harry's presence, she was forced to relive that pain. Leaving Privet Drive might have felt like surrendering the last bit of her perceived superiority. She had married a respectable man, raised a normal son, and kept a tidy home. To flee would be to admit that magic had won. Dudley's presence was another anchor. The Dursleys had designed their entire life around their son's comfort. His school, his friends, his routines, all of them mattered more than Harry's outbursts. To move would have unsettled Dudley's world, and Vernon and Petunia would never allow the needs of their nephew to interfere with the golden child's comfort. They chose to let Harry suffer rather than disrupt the life they had constructed for Dudley. There's also the question of denial. Both Dursleys clung to the belief that if they pretended long enough, the magic would disappear. They forbade Harry from asking questions, They discouraged imagination, storytelling, even kindness. When Harry asked about his parents, he was told, "They died in a car crash. Drunk, I expect?" Every truth was buried under lies. Moving would have forced them to face those lies. To start anew, they would have to explain everything again. Their staying was, in essence, a twisted act of resistance. Against a world they didn't understand, against a child they feared, against a truth they couldn't change. Every time Harry levitated a cupcake or grew his fingernails overnight, they doubled down. They tightened the rules, made the punishments harsher, the silence thicker. But they never left. Even when Hagrid finally appeared and told Harry the truth, they still resisted. Vernon tried to deny it, tried to drag Harry away. Petunia screamed about her sister, but they had already lost. The truth had entered the house, and no amount of running could have prevented it. They had chosen to stand their ground, and now the ground itself had shifted. Their refusal to move, then, was not just an oversight or a matter of convenience. It was the clearest sign of their fear. They feared the judgment of neighbours, the disruption of routine, the challenge to their authority, but most of all they feared being seen for who they truly were, people who built their lives on denial, who locked truth in a cupboard and hoped it would stay there. In the end, it didn't. It never could. Number 19, why didn't they send Harry to an orphanage? It's a question that has haunted many thoughtful readers ever since they first opened the pages of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone and met the unpleasant Dursleys. If they despised Harry so much, why didn't they simply get rid of him? Why didn't Petunia and Vernon take the more logical route, placing Harry in an orphanage or arranging for someone else to raise him? The wizarding world had no overt control over them. Dumbledore left only a letter, and yet, for 10 long years, they kept a child they neither loved nor wanted. Why? The answer, like much of J.K. Rowling's storytelling, lies in a complex web of psychological tension, magical interference, and subtle manipulation. But to understand it properly, we must walk through the Dursleys' narrow hallway, peek into their meticulously arranged living room, and listen to the whispers behind closed doors, where resentment and fear quietly grew together like ivy around their lives. Vernon and Petunia Dursley were not simply intolerant, they were afraid. They feared difference, abnormality, and unpredictability. This fear governed their every action, from what they allowed Dudley to eat to what they pretended not to see in Harry. The very presence of Harry Potter in their home was not only an inconvenience, it was a daily reminder of a world they had spent years denying. Vernon's hatred, while explosive, was built on this foundation of terror that their carefully constructed normal life could be shattered by the madness of magic. Petunia, for her part, bore the deeper wound. Her rejection of Harry was not only practical, it was emotional, personal. In the Half-Blood Prince, we learn from Dumbledore's memory that Petunia had once written to him as a child, begging to be allowed into Hogwarts. Her rejection marked her soul. Harry, with his messy black hair and unmistakable green eyes, was a living embodiment of everything she could never be. To give him away might have freed her from the burden of caring for her sister's son, but it would not have freed her from that gnawing jealousy. And that made her unwilling to simply forget him. Keeping him close allowed her to punish the boy, and in some buried part of herself, to punish her sister. Dumbledore's decision to leave Harry at Privet Drive with only a letter may seem irresponsible. But Dumbledore was no fool. He understood the human heart better than most. When he left the infant Harry on the doorstep that night in November 1981, he was not only binding Harry to a blood protection spell, he was binding the Dursleys to a moral contract. "You will take him," the letter implied, "or face consequences from a world you do not understand." Even if Vernon and Petunia considered giving him up, the fear of magical reprisal may have been enough to silence that impulse. There is also the matter of guilt. Petunia had not merely distanced herself from Lily, she had allowed the divide to become an abyss. She had missed her sister's funeral. She had never replied to her letters. In keeping Harry, Petunia may have believed, consciously or not, that she was doing penance. Not an emotional penance, never that, but a dutiful one. A rigid, cold sacrifice that kept her respectable in her own eyes. And then there was the boy himself. Harry Potter, quiet and polite, was not the kind of child who caused tantrums or broke windows. He took up little space in their world, literally sleeping in a cupboard. His presence was an irritation, not a catastrophe. Had he been violent, wild, or openly magical from an early age, things might have been different. But Harry's magic only flickered in moments of emotional stress. He was, to them, just manageable enough. There is a key passage in The Philosopher's Stone that offers a glimpse into the Dursleys' true discomfort. When letters from Hogwarts begin flooding their house, Vernon spirals into near madness. The very idea of Harry re-entering the magical world horrifies him, not just because of what Harry is, but because it might force them to acknowledge their failure to keep him normal. They had spent a decade suppressing his nature. Giving him away, especially to a state institution, would be tantamount to admitting defeat. Worse, it would risk others discovering what he was. Imagine for a moment that they had indeed tried to give him up. What would they have said to social workers? We want to give up our nephew because he's unnatural. How would they explain the incident with the snake at the zoo, or the time Harry ended up on the school roof? Petunia and Vernon were obsessed with appearances. Giving Harry away would have meant exposing their family's flaws, and that in their rigid suburban world was unthinkable. The Dursleys' social paranoia ran deep. In the Order of the Phoenix, when Vernon learns that two magical beings, Tonks and Kingsley, are watching over Harry, he is immediately unnerved. We're not talking about some criminal gang, Vernon says. We're talking about national security. His terror stems not from the danger itself, but from the idea that he and his family are entangled in something public, something uncontrollable. Sending Harry away would have made them vulnerable to questions, attention, scrutiny. There's also something else, a less comfortable truth. The Dursleys were cruel, yes, but they were also selfish. Harry was not merely a burden, he was free labor. He cooked their meals, mowed the lawn, cleaned the bathroom. He was the scapegoat, the one who absorbed their anxieties and rage. As Dudley grew into a spoiled and violent child, Harry became the necessary contrast. Without Harry, who would Dudley look down upon? Who would Vernon yell at during stressful mornings? Who would Petunia scold to feel superior? To remove Harry from the household would be to remove a vital component of their family's emotional dynamic. In the Chamber of Secrets, when Dobby comes to warn Harry and the Dursleys lock him in his room with bars on the window, it is a terrifying moment. But it also reveals how far they were willing to go to keep him under control, physically and psychologically. This was not just about keeping Harry away from Hogwarts. It was about domination. They didn't want to remove him, they wanted to break him. And when they couldn't, they punished him for it. By the time Harry reached age 11, he had endured nearly a decade of subtle torture. But from the Dursleys' point of view, it was containment. To send him away would be to release something they had tried to bury. They didn't know what would happen if they let him go. Would he come back stronger? Would wizards take notice? Would they be punished for neglect? The unknown was more frightening than the inconvenience of feeding one more mouth. We must also remember that Petunia had made a choice long ago to shut the door on magic. But that door never really closed. Lily's death opened it again, and Harry's arrival pushed it wide. Every day that Harry lived in her house, she was confronted with the life she had rejected. Giving him up might have ended the daily reminders, but it would also be another act of betrayal. One too many, perhaps. And there is another factor, one seldom discussed, fear of what others might think. Not magical others, but neighbors, colleagues. If Vernon and Petunia had given away Lily's son, what would they tell the people on Privet Drive? That the child was too strange, too different, that he caused accidents? The Dursleys thrived on being seen as perfectly normal. To admit they couldn't handle a child, especially one they had claimed to adopt out of familial duty, would have cracked their social armor. There is a moment in the Goblet of Fire when Vernon demands to know how much gold Harry has. "You're not taking money from my vault, are you?" It's revealing. It shows that despite everything, Vernon is aware that Harry might hold value, even if he doesn't understand how or why. The idea that they could profit from him, or at least control him, may have factored into their decision to keep him. If nothing else, they believed that as long as Harry was under their roof, they could limit his influence on their own lives. In the end, it's important to remember what Dumbledore tells Harry in The Half-Blood Prince. You are protected by an ancient magic of your mother's making. The protection worked because Petunia, Lily's sister, kept Harry in her home. Whether she did it out of guilt, fear, or spite, it didn't matter. The spell held. Perhaps deep down Petunia felt it. Perhaps she sensed, even if she never said it, that sending Harry away would break something, not just in the magical sense, but in the spiritual one. Ultimately, the Dursleys' decision to keep Harry cannot be explained by logic alone. It is a tapestry of emotions, fear, resentment, guilt, social pressure, and quiet desperation. They were not villains in the traditional sense. They were small, bitter people trapped in a lie of their own making. And in that lie, Harry was both prisoner and proof. To remove him would have been an admission of failure. To give him away would have been to acknowledge the truth, that magic existed and that it was stronger than their will. And that, above all, was something Vernon and Petunia Dursley could never allow. Number 20. Why weren't they afraid of magical visitors? When Rubeus Hagrid stormed into the rickety cabin on the rock, breaking down the door with a thud that echoed through the storm, the Dursleys cowered in fear. Petunia whimpered. Vernon reached for a gun. Dudley tried to hide behind his mother. It was the first time a real wizard had stood in front of them in flesh and blood, towering, wild-haired, and holding a pink umbrella charged with unimaginable power. In that moment, the fear of magic was tangible. It was etched into every glance and every trembling word. Hagrid didn't just represent something strange, he was a force of nature they couldn't comprehend. But only a few years later, the Dursleys would sit stiffly in their prim living room, facing Albus Dumbledore himself, a wizard whose mere presence could silence an entire hall of teenage wizards without flinching. Petunia clicked her tongue disapprovingly at his muddy boots. Vernon snarled insults at Arthur Weasley when he visited via Floo powder and accidentally destroyed half their fireplace. They acted not only without fear, but with outright contempt. The transformation is jarring. Once terrified of the word magic, the Dursleys seemed to evolve into people who mocked it with impunity. How could such a change take place? What happened to the trembling fear that made Petunia hide in the kitchen whenever owls appeared? The answer lies in a complex web of denial, pride, and the simple human tendency to adapt to the abnormal if exposed to it often enough. Yet beyond that, there's something deeper. An emotional callousness born not of courage, but of something closer to moral blindness. It's important to remember who the Dursleys were at their core. From the very first chapter of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, they were described as people who prided themselves on being normal, thank you very much. Their fear of magic was not purely out of awe, it was rooted in a desperate desire to exclude anything that threatened their sense of order. Petunia's hatred was personal. Her sister had been a witch, and she had not. For Vernon, magic was a disruption, a form of chaos he could not control. Their fear was emotional, not rational. So when Hagrid arrived, it wasn't just the shock of magic, but the shock of losing control. Their fortress of denial was breached. The world they worked so hard to ignore had smashed into their lives with a crash and a flying door. But as days turned to years and magic kept intruding in small, persistent ways, howlers, letters, owls, fireplace explosions, they became numb to the shock. Exposure dulls fear. The strange becomes routine. Magic, once the stuff of nightmares, became something they could roll their eyes at, even if reluctantly. By the time Arthur Weasley visited them in the Order of the Phoenix, the Dursleys had already endured years of magical interruptions. Harry's presence was a daily reminder of a world they couldn't escape. Arthur, kind and well-meaning, didn't fit the terrifying image of a dark sorcerer. And yet Vernon's reaction was a blend of bluster and condescension. When Arthur accidentally blasted apart the Dursleys' living room instead of fear, there was outrage. Vernon shouted not because he feared Arthur's wand, but because he felt his world was being vandalized. His home, his symbol of control, was under assault. It is here that we must introduce an uncomfortable truth. The Dursleys' courage was a facade. They were not brave in the face of magic. They were arrogant. Arrogance is not the absence of fear, but the illusion that one is immune to consequences. Vernon believed that the Ministry of Magic, or Dumbledore, would never stoop to harming him. He had, after all, taken Harry in. In his mind, he had leverage. They wouldn't dare, he might have thought. They need me to keep their little wizard alive. But this line of thinking ignores key moments that reveal just how little leverage Vernon truly had. Dumbledore's entrance in Half-Blood Prince was not gentle. He made himself at home, forced the Dursleys to offer drinks and conjured chairs with a flick of his wand. And still, Vernon tried to puff himself up like a toad. "You didn't tell us you were bringing company," he muttered. Dumbledore, unfazed, ignored the comment. There was no spell cast, no threats made, and that's the secret. Wizards often chose not to retaliate. They tolerated the Dursleys' disdain, perhaps because they pitied them, or because they understood how far removed they were from the magical world. The Dursleys mistook this mercy for weakness. They believed they were safe because they had never been punished. But mercy is not the same as powerlessness. Dumbledore could have turned them into toads with a wave of his hand. Arthur Weasley could have erased their memories. Hagrid, in a moment of justified fury, did give Dudley a pig's tail, but that was the exception, not the rule. The wizards chose restraint, and the Dursleys, blind to nuance, interpreted it as permission to sneer. Their behavior can also be understood through the lens of denial. The more they insulted magic, the more they reaffirmed to themselves that they were above it. It was a coping mechanism. Magic isn't real, they told themselves through every eye-roll and snide remark. It's just nonsense, just freak stuff. In this way, their contempt was a shield against the uncomfortable truth that their reality had been forever invaded by something they couldn't control. Petunia's own trauma cannot be overlooked. Her sister had been taken into a world she could never access. In the Philosopher's Stone, she rants, "My sister got a letter just like that and disappeared off to that school and came home every holiday with her pockets full of frog spawn. Her hatred was deeply personal. To admit magic was real was to admit that she had been left behind. It was easier to mock it than to grieve it." Vernon, meanwhile, was a textbook bully. He used volume to mask insecurity. His anger was his armor. When he shouted at wizards, it wasn't because he felt strong, but because he felt cornered. His mind could not process a world where he wasn't in control, and so he barked louder, stomped harder, pretended harder. It's a defense mechanism common among people who face something they cannot defeat. They pretend it doesn't matter. In the Order of the Phoenix, when Mad-Eye Moody and other members of the Order appear to escort Harry, Vernon's reaction is again not fear, but outrage. "You're not taking him anywhere," he protests, as if he could stop them. He had no power, but he still imagined he could bargain. The Dursleys had built such thick emotional walls that they no longer feared wizards as people. They feared them as a concept, and concepts can be dismissed. One could argue that the Dursleys, especially Vernon, were emboldened by the knowledge that wizards followed rules. They had come to understand that the magical world had its own legal system with its own consequences. As long as they didn't technically break any rules, they were safe. It's no accident that Vernon always referred to those people with disdain, but never crossed the line into actual violence against Harry once the letters began arriving. Somewhere, deep inside, he understood that retaliation was possible. He just convinced himself it wasn't likely. In contrast, consider how muggles with no exposure to magic might react to a visit from Dumbledore. Most would collapse in awe or flee in terror. But the Dursleys had spent a decade acclimating to strangeness. The extraordinary had become routine, a floating pudding, shrinking sweaters, vanishing glass. By the time wizards began appearing in their living room, they were numb to the surreal. It's also telling that the Dursleys only ever showed true terror when the magic touched them directly. When Hagrid gave Dudley a pig's tail, when owls flooded their house, when letters rained through the fireplace. In those moments, they lost control of their environment and their fear surfaced. But when magic happened to someone else, or when the wizard was simply present, they could maintain the illusion of control, and with it, their smug contempt. Dumbledore understood all of this. In Half-Blood Prince, he speaks to them with a level of courtesy that is almost mocking in its politeness. He doesn't need to raise his voice. His power is obvious in every word, every gesture. He offers them a chance to show kindness one last time. They fail. Even as they prepare to go into hiding, being protected from Voldemort's wrath, they can't bring themselves to say thank you. The arrogance runs too deep. The real tragedy is not that the Dursleys were unafraid, it's that they were unmoved. Magic could not reach their hearts. They were not transformed by it, not even when Harry risked everything to save the world they lived in, not even when Dumbledore died. They had built walls so high that no spell could climb them, and yet, in one of the final moments before they leave, a small crack appears. Dudley, the boy who once called Harry a freak, turns and says, "I don't think you're a waste of space." It's not much, but it's something. Perhaps, after all, the Dursleys were not immune to change. Perhaps fear was only the first layer, and underneath it, slowly, painfully, something else had begun to grow. In the end, the Dursleys' fear vanished not because they became brave, but because they convinced themselves they were untouchable. The wizards around them showed mercy, and they mistook it for weakness. Their contempt was a shield, their pride a mask. But magic was never something they truly understood. It was something they endured, despised, and feared in secret. The Dursleys didn't forget their fear, they buried it. And in doing so, they lost the one thing magic might have given them: wonder. Number 21. Why didn't they check Harry's belongings? Every summer, Harry Potter returned to number 4, Privet Drive, dragging a heavy trunk filled with magical belongings. His wand lay tucked beside textbooks with animated covers, his invisibility cloak crumpled beneath a tangle of wizard robes, and Bertie Bott's every flavor beans rolled about near a cracked sneakoscope. And yet not once did the Dursleys, the very people who hated magic with every fiber of their being, show a genuine desire to search his possessions. This detail, often overlooked in the grand saga, opens a curious door into the psychology of Vernon, Petunia, and Dudley Dursley. Their behavior was not just a matter of fear or hatred, it was a calculated, deeply repressed refusal to confront the very thing they detested. One would expect a family so intent on stamping out the abnormality in Harry to approach his return from Hogwarts with suspicion, maybe even vigilance. From the moment they left him on the doorstep, the Dursleys were determined to make him as ordinary as possible. He was locked in cupboards, given old rags to wear, and told his parents had died in a car crash. Vernon and Petunia invested real energy into constructing a lie that kept magic out of their perfect suburban life. Yet when the boy returned home each summer, carrying objects that practically screamed, "Wizard?" they never lifted the lid. Consider his wand. It is the most dangerous and explicitly magical object in his possession. In Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, Harry is seen clutching it as he prepares to duel the Dursleys' fury after Dobby's interference. Vernon snarls, "You're not allowed to use magic outside that school," and slams the door. But notably, he does not demand the wand itself. Not once do they take it away. In fact, the only time Vernon tries to confiscate magical items is in a fit of emotional rage, like when he locks away Harry's school letters in the first book. Even then, the trunk stays untouched. There's something oddly telling in that. The Dursleys were not afraid of magic, they were afraid of acknowledging it. Searching Harry's belongings would be tantamount to admitting its reality. Petunia, who grew up watching her sister receive Hogwarts letters and practice charms at home, lived with the memory of magic etched painfully into her past. In the Philosopher's Stone, she snaps, "My sister got a letter just like that and disappeared off to that school." Her hatred was fueled not just by fear, but envy and resentment. To see spellbooks and potions equipment again would reignite that wound. Vernon, on the other hand, operated on brute denial. To him, magic was indecent, something to be ignored like a scandalous rumor. If he could keep Harry locked in his room and pretend Hogwarts didn't exist for 2 months, then reality was bent to his satisfaction. Any act of opening the trunk, of physically touching those items, would violate his own twisted code of order. His control came from pretending it wasn't there, not from understanding or disarming it. Their neglect was not from ignorance. They knew full well what Harry brought back with him. When Harry threatens Dudley with, "You haven't met any of the monsters yet," referring to his magical life, Vernon turns pale. He believes. He just refuses to engage. In Prisoner of Azkaban, when Uncle Vernon reads the letter about Harry needing permission to visit Hogsmeade, his reaction is one of grudging tolerance, not inquiry. He doesn't ask what Hogsmeade is. He doesn't question why Harry needs a form signed. He signs it under threat of Sirius Black's imagined fury. There's no inspection, no questions, just submission to the facade of normalcy. Even when Harry's belongings posed a direct nuisance, the Dursleys avoided interaction. When Ron sends Harry the Howler in Chamber of Secrets, it explodes in front of the entire family. The letter screams, drawing attention to Harry's magical life in the most dramatic way possible. What's Vernon's response? Silence and seething avoidance. He doesn't demand to know where it came from. He doesn't confiscate the owl or the books. Instead, he does what the Dursleys always do, pretend it didn't happen. One might expect that by the 4th or 5th year, the Dursleys would adapt their methods, perhaps even try to involve the authorities or reach out to Dumbledore, but they don't, not when Harry returns with a firebolt in Prisoner of Azkaban, not even when he brings back galleons or an enchanted photo album. Petunia's only visible response to magical items is a flinch. She recoils from the invisibility cloak as if it were a live snake, but never touches it. It's as if she believes touching these objects would corrupt her. Their behavior is reminiscent of people who live in deliberate cognitive dissonance. They see the threat, they feel the fear, but they compartmentalize it to maintain psychological order. In Order of the Phoenix, Harry returns home after witnessing Cedric's death and facing Lord Voldemort. He arrives with a suitcase full of trauma, but the Dursleys ask no questions. Instead, Vernon grumbles about keeping the house quiet and not disturbing the neighbors. This, again, is their coping mechanism: silence, distance, and denial. The refusal to search Harry's trunk may also have stemmed from a sense of unease, almost superstition. Though Vernon barked with confidence, he was a coward at heart. Just as he trembled at the mention of Sirius Black, he likely imagined the trunk to be cursed or dangerous. A self-preserving instinct may have told him, "Don't touch what you don't understand." Wizards were unpredictable, and Harry's belongings, by extension, were nuclear. Perhaps, too, there was a growing understanding that Harry had power, not just magical, but social. In Chamber of Secrets, the Dursleys are terrified when they learn Harry has friends who send him letters. They realize he's no longer isolated. And as the years go on, Harry becomes more confident, more connected. By Half-Blood Prince, the Dursleys know that he is backed by an entire world they do not understand. The days of locking him in cupboards are over. Searching his belongings by then would be a violation of territory they no longer controlled. There's also a question of Dudley. While he showed little interest in Harry's world, it's curious that he never tried to sneak a peek. But even Dudley, raised in an environment of entitlement and ignorance, had absorbed his parents' fear of magic. In Goblet of Fire, when the Tung-Tung Toffee incident leaves him with a grotesquely enlarged tongue, Vernon blames Harry instantly. Yet even after that magical humiliation, the family still does not storm Harry's room to purge his supplies. One of the more vivid examples comes in Order of the Phoenix, when Moody, Tonks and Lupin arrive to escort Harry from the Dursleys' house. The living room is suddenly filled with wizards, wands drawn, robes swirling, and polite but stern warnings about keeping Harry safe. The Dursleys are silent. They nod. They don't protest or scream or call the police. They are, once again, pretending not to understand, even in the presence of undeniable magic. If they had ever doubted before, this was the final confirmation, but it only deepened their silence. This is why when Dumbledore arrives in Half-Blood Prince to collect Harry, the Dursleys behave like frightened civilians caught in a battle they never signed up for. They avoid eye contact, they stand still, and again they do not attempt to take Harry's wand or his books or his trunk. The idea of interfering would be akin to suicide. Their terror is no longer abstract. It is rooted in experience. They have seen owls burst through windows, letters fly down chimneys, and tongues grow like sausages. They know Harry's trunk is more than it seems. What's remarkable is that Harry never hides his belongings. He leaves his trunk open. He writes letters to Ron and Hermione in full view. In Goblet of Fire, when the Weasleys arrive via the fireplace and blast half the living room apart, Arthur Weasley tries to be diplomatic. But the Dursleys are too horrified to respond. Still, not once does Vernon demand to see what's inside Harry's luggage. The idea is too unbearable. This unspoken agreement between them, Harry not flaunting magic too much, and the Dursleys not looking too closely, creates a fragile ceasefire. It keeps the peace in a house teetering on emotional collapse. To search the trunk would be to invite chaos, to acknowledge that their world is built on a lie. The Dursleys' selectivity is perhaps best symbolized in the locked cupboard under the stairs. It's a space of containment, not just for Harry, but for anything inconvenient. In their minds, if something can be boxed, hidden, ignored, it ceases to exist. And so Harry's belongings are not a collection of magical tools. They are a suitcase of shame they dare not touch. It is not that the Dursleys lacked the desire to suppress magic. It is that their denial was so deep, their repression so absolute, that they built a wall around the very idea. To search Harry's trunk would be to tear down that wall, and in doing so they would be forced to see magic not as a ghost haunting their lives, but as a real, living force that they could neither understand nor defeat. So they turned away, year after year. Even as Harry's world grew darker, even as Voldemort returned, even as owls brought news of war and death, the Dursleys clung to their illusion. They could lock Harry in a room, ban his owl, shout at his friends, but they would never, ever open that trunk, because in that trunk was truth, and truth, to them, was the most dangerous magic of all. Number 22. Why didn't they take away Harry's owl? In the heart of Little Whinging, in the most ordinary suburb of Surrey, there stood a house that wanted nothing to do with the abnormal. Number 4, Privet Drive, was a shrine to routine and repression, a bastion of the boring. And yet, inside one of its upstairs bedrooms, a caged creature of another world watched the world with amber eyes. Hedwig, the snowy owl, was a glaring contradiction to everything the Dursleys believed in. She was magical, majestic, and she had no place in a house that polished away anything remotely unusual. Yet, curiously, she remained. Hedwig was not just any pet. She was a magical creature, a symbol of a world the Dursleys feared and loathed. She arrived with Harry on his first journey back from Hogwarts and immediately marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one that Aunt Petunia and Uncle Vernon wished had never started. Still, year after year, Hedwig remained in her cage, often hooting loudly, rustling her feathers in indignation, and flying off on mysterious errands at night. Her presence was as loud and magical as fireworks in a living room, and yet the Dursleys never got rid of her. What makes this more puzzling is that the Dursleys were not subtle in their distaste for anything magical. Vernon Dursley, a man who roared at the sight of a wand and flushed purple when the word wizard was even whispered, never hesitated to punish Harry for even the mildest hint of strangeness. Petunia, who had spent a lifetime trying to scrub out the shame of her sister's bloodline, never missed an opportunity to criticize Harry's magical connections. And Dudley, well, Dudley mostly screamed when magic was near. So why did they tolerate Hedwig? There is a key moment in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets when Vernon Dursley locks Hedwig in her cage and bars the window shut, hoping to stop any letters from reaching Harry. But even then his focus was on stopping communication with the magical world, removing the source of that communication altogether. In fact, at no point did he suggest getting rid of the owl. Why? For a family obsessed with control, it seems almost uncharacteristically lenient. Hedwig was more than a pet. She was a constant reminder to the Dursleys that they had failed to keep Harry normal. She was a creature of the night, gliding silently through the air and returning with letters from castles. And she made noise. Owls don't bark or meow, they hoot loudly in the middle of the night. And unlike a dog, they can't be trained to sit or stay. Vernon Dursley once nearly had a heart attack when an owl flew into the fireplace delivering a Hogwarts letter. So how did he not throw this one out? There's no doubt that Hedwig irritated them. In Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, when Harry returned home after his 4th year, the Dursleys were still disturbed by the hooting. Vernon even demanded silence from the owl. "That ruddy bird," he growled, glaring at her cage. But his threats were hollow. He didn't throw her out. He didn't release her into the wild. He didn't even sell her, though surely some dodgy pet shop would have taken a snowy owl off his hands. So what held him back? One explanation lies in fear. The Dursleys, for all their bluster, were terrified of wizards. In the Philosopher's Stone, Hagrid bends Vernon's shotgun like rubber and blasts the door down to retrieve Harry. That moment carved a deep impression in Vernon's psyche. It showed him what wizards could do when provoked. And though Hagrid didn't say it outright, the unspoken warning was clear. Harm Harry, or what belongs to him, and the magical world would know. Fear is a powerful motivator. The Dursleys may have believed that hurting Hedwig could result in more magical retaliation. It's one thing to berate a child you consider a burden. It's another to harm a magical creature who might be magically bonded to a boy already destined for strange greatness. Their reluctance to touch the owl may have been self-preservation in its most practical form, but fear alone doesn't tell the whole story. The Dursleys were not subtle people. If they wanted something gone, they made it disappear. They burned Harry's letters. They boarded up his cupboard. They silenced his birthday with threats and punishments. If Hedwig had truly crossed their threshold of tolerance, they would have found a way to remove her. The fact that they didn't suggests something deeper, an uneasy truce. This truce likely came from Petunia. She, more than Vernon, understood what the magical world was capable of. She had watched her sister Lily disappear into that world and return transformed. She had seen the results of defying the unknown, and most of all, she had grown up watching Lily receive owls. The presence of Hedwig was not new to her in concept, though perhaps still unwelcome. Perhaps in some corner of her memory, Hedwig reminded her of her sister, of what she lost, and maybe that made her hesitate. Petunia's fear was mingled with guilt. In Order of the Phoenix, when Dumbledore sends a howler to remind her of the promise she made, she freezes. Her sense of obligation is stronger than her hate. She knows that as long as Harry lives under her roof, certain lines must not be crossed. Hedwig may have been one of those lines, a magical boundary she dared not violate. Hedwig was not just a messenger, she was a sentinel. Her presence meant that Harry had eyes and wings outside Privet Drive. She kept him connected to his friends, his school, and his world. And maybe, on some level, that frightened the Dursleys more than the owl herself, because it meant they couldn't fully control him. He had an ally, even in a cage, and that made their grip on him just a little weaker. In The Prisoner of Azkaban, after an argument about school letters and forms, Vernon snaps and says, "If there's something wrong with the owl, then send it back. I want it gone. But even then he does nothing. The threat is empty. The owl remains. And that tells us something. For all their hatred, the Dursleys had reached a point where Hedwig was an accepted, if resented, fixture of the household. We must also consider that by removing Hedwig they risked an unpredictable magical reaction, not just from Harry, but from Hogwarts itself. Imagine the fury of Professor McGonagall if she learned Harry's owl had been released or hurt. Or worse, imagine another visit from Hagrid. The Dursleys were not brave, and they were not stupid. They knew better than to invite magical chaos into their lives again. But there's also the possibility that despite everything, Hedwig became part of the scenery. People adapt, even to the bizarre. Over time, her presence became a kind of background noise. A source of frustration, yes, but not a crisis. The hooting, the fluttering, the glaring eyes, it all became part of the daily discomfort the Dursleys accepted in exchange for peace. Removing her might have disrupted that fragile equilibrium. And there's irony here too. In trying so hard to isolate Harry from magic, the Dursleys allowed one of the most magical creatures in his life to stay. Hedwig represented everything they hated: independence, mystery, loyalty, and yet she lived under their roof, untouched. Perhaps that's the deepest truth. The Dursleys weren't just afraid of Hedwig. They were afraid of what it would mean to Harry if they took her away. Harry's connection to Hedwig was not trivial, it was deeply emotional. She was his first real gift, a birthday present from Hagrid, yes, but also a symbol of freedom, of being seen and cared for. Taking her away would have been an act of cruelty too bold even for the Dursleys, and perhaps, buried under all their bitterness, they weren't prepared to cross that final line. Even Dudley, who punched and bullied without pause, never touched Hedwig. Not out of kindness, but out of a primal sense that some boundaries should not be crossed. He may not have understood magic, but he understood danger. The owl was off limits. A silent agreement hung in the air at Privet Drive. Don't touch the owl and maybe nothing worse will happen. Number 23. Why did they keep driving Harry to the train station? Of all the countless paradoxes that lace the tale of Harry Potter's early years, few are as quietly strange and curiously haunting as the annual ritual of the Dursleys escorting him to King's Cross Station. It stands as a silent contradiction, a subtle crack in the Dursleys' otherwise airtight campaign of magical denial. These were the same people who once screamed at letters flying through the chimney, the same family who built a wooden booth to shield themselves from owls and attempted to flee to a rock in the sea. And yet, year after year, they loaded Harry and his battered luggage into the car, drove into London's humming centre, and left him at the gates of platform 9 3/4. A platform they couldn't see, a platform they loathed in theory but still somehow allowed. It wasn't as though the Dursleys ever softened. Their attitude remained hard as flint. Vernon's face still turned an alarming shade of puce when confronted with anything even remotely magical. Petunia still twitched at the sound of the word Hogwarts, and Dudley never passed up an opportunity to sneer at Harry's freakishness. And yet each September they made that trip. Even when Vernon was in a foul mood, even when Petunia was caught in that tightrope walk between fear and disgust, even when Dudley whined about wasting his day, they never said no. Not once. They could have. They had the power to do so. And still, they didn't. Why did they do it? Why did they, of all people, support, even begrudgingly, Harry's continued access to the magical world they so reviled? This was not mere tolerance. This was active participation. To put it more bluntly, they made sure the boy who lived in the cupboard under the stairs got back to a world where he had power, where he was famous, where he wasn't theirs. The logic cracks here like thin ice underfoot. One might be tempted to assume it was fear. Certainly, by the time Harry turned 11, Vernon and Petunia had realized the power Harry represented, not just his own potential, but the towering force of the magical world behind him. In Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, Vernon's reaction to Hagrid's arrival is pure horror. He tries to silence Harry, to suppress the truth, to maintain the illusion of normalcy. But Hagrid, a half-giant with a heart as big as his frame, crashes through their careful delusions like a wrecking ball. He informs them plainly that Harry will be going to Hogwarts. There is no room for negotiation, but that was year 1. What about years 2, 3, and beyond? What about when the Dursleys were no longer under threat of Hagrid's umbrella or Dumbledore's letters? What about when the wizarding world was fighting battles Harry himself barely understood? Each year they could have drawn a line in the sand and said, "No more." They could have handed him a street map and a £20 note. But instead, they made the journey. It's not that the Dursleys were afraid of what would happen if Harry didn't return to school, not directly. As the books go on, they continue to abuse and belittle him. They never act as though they fear retaliation from magical authorities. In fact, Vernon seems increasingly bold in his cruelty, especially during the summer before Harry's 5th year, when the Ministry is collapsing and Dementors are attacking children. Their fear, if it existed, was not consistent. And still, they drove him. There is a moment in the Chamber of Secrets where the balance tips. After Dobby the house elf nearly kills Aunt Petunia's pudding and ruins Vernon's dinner party with the Masons, Harry is imprisoned in his room. The Dursleys go so far as to install bars on his window. They lock him in. They plan to keep him out of Hogwarts forever. "You're never going back to that school," Vernon snarls, and this time it feels like he means it. But Harry escapes, not by magic of his own, but through the intervention of the Weasleys in their enchanted Ford Anglia. This rescue is more than just an act of kindness. It serves as a reminder. Harry has allies. He has people who care. And he has access to a world that can breach the fortress of Privet Drive at any time. The Dursleys, for all their paranoia, begin to understand that they are not untouchable. Not anymore. By the 3rd year, Vernon has softened his grip, not because of kindness, but because of survival. He allows Harry to go to King's Cross with a grunt and a warning, especially once he hears of Sirius Black. "If you've been writing to that maniac Black," he hisses, "you'll be in serious trouble." Yet, even knowing that Harry is connected to a wanted criminal, even when Petunia looks like she might faint from fear, they still drive him to the station. They don't call the police. They don't try to hide him. They open the door and send him on his way. And what about the 4th year? In Goblet of Fire, Harry's fame explodes. He's the Hogwarts champion. The Tri-Wizard tournament draws international attention. The Dursleys, ever obsessed with appearances, know this. They know that Harry's no longer just a freak in their eyes. He is a boy on the front page. But even that doesn't move them to change. They don't claim him, they don't boast, and still they drive him. It is a quiet ritual now, something done not with affection, but with a strange sense of obligation. The 5th year brings the darkest shift. Harry has seen Voldemort return. He is isolated. The Ministry is corrupt. The Dursleys are no longer just an annoyance. They are guardians by name only. But something odd happens. Dumbledore sends a howler to Petunia. "Remember my last, Petunia?" The words ring with power. She flinches, she obeys. And we learn something crucial. Petunia knows more than she ever let on. She knows the magic is real. She knows it can't be stopped. And perhaps, deep down, she knows Harry must go back. It isn't kindness, it's self-preservation. The deeper truth may lie in that thread. The Dursleys are not kind people, but they are rule followers. Petunia, obsessed with propriety, with being seen as normal, will often bend to perceived authority. If Dumbledore implies a command, even indirectly, she obeys. She doesn't ask questions, she doesn't fight it. She does what's required. For all her hatred of Lily, all her venom toward Harry, she recognizes, maybe even fears, the implications of disobedience. And Vernon, who hates what he does not understand, who lives in a house of rules and grumbling routines, likely continues the ritual for the same reason he continues everything else. It is expected. It keeps the peace. It gets the boy out of the house. It ends the summer, and perhaps somewhere in his gruff, red-faced mind is a buried understanding. Keeping Harry from Hogwarts would not make him less magical. It would make him unstable, and Vernon values control above all things. There is also the unspoken truth that the Dursleys, in for all their cruelty, rely on the structure Harry's absence brings. With him gone, life resumes a rhythm they crave. Dudley gets all the attention. Vernon can shout at the news without interruption. Petunia can clean in silence. Harry's time away is, for them, a relief. Driving him to the station is not a favour, it is a removal, a return to their carefully constructed fiction of normalcy. But there's something else, something even more subtle. Could it be guilt? Could it be that Petunia, who once begged Dumbledore in a letter to let her attend Hogwarts too, who resented her sister not just for being magical but for being chosen? Could it be that she sees in Harry's retreating figure the life she never had? There is a line in the Philosopher's Stone when Harry mentions the name Azkaban, and Petunia blanches. She knows that name. She has heard it. She has lived on the edge of this world longer than she admits, and maybe, just maybe, she feels the echo of loss. By the 6th year, they do not speak much to him. The war is near. Death Eaters are watching. Vernon's bluster grows thinner. Petunia's hands shake when she wipes the counter. And still they drive him. Not because they believe in what he is, but because they cannot stop what he is. They are no longer in control, and driving him to King's Cross becomes the last thing they can control. In the end, perhaps the ritual of the train station says more about fear than about family. It is a mirror, not of affection, but of inevitability. The Dursleys are dragged year by year into a role they never wanted, guardians to a boy they despise but must not break. And Harry, for all his pain, steps onto that platform not with gratitude, but with resolve. He knows who they are, he knows what they are not, and still, he goes. They never walk him through, they never say goodbye, but they go, every year until they no longer can. And in that quiet, bitter drive lies one of the strangest, saddest truths of the entire story. They hated magic, but they couldn't stop it. And so they drove. Number 24. Why didn't they read Harry's letters? The Dursleys were never subtle. Their obsession with normality, their frantic desire to erase any hint of magic from their lives, was displayed in every corner of 4 Privet Drive. From the rigid routine of their mornings to the stiff smiles reserved for neighbours, Vernon and Petunia Dursley sought control over their environment like a man desperately trying to cage the wind. Yet for all their efforts to monitor Harry Potter, to confine him, to starve him of affection and freedom, there is a peculiar omission in their tyrannical rule. Despite their deep hatred for anything remotely magical, they never once seemed to read, intercept, or destroy the letters Harry received from the wizarding world once he started school at Hogwarts. This absence of interference is baffling. The Dursleys went to extreme lengths to keep magic out of their home. They denied Harry his Hogwarts letters, culminating in a mad dash to a shack on a rock in the sea, just to escape the onslaught of envelopes. But after Harry returned from his first year, victorious from the ordeal with the Philosopher's Stone, and more embedded in the magical world than ever, the Dursleys inexplicably ceased to care about the content of his correspondence. Consider how Vernon treated the first Hogwarts letter. He burned it. He nailed the mail slot shut. He even uprooted his entire family in an attempt to flee from the relentless stream of letters. And yet, by the summer after first year, Harry is seen receiving letters from Ron and Hermione without a word of protest. Even when Ron sends an enchanted letter via Muggle post, stuffed with stamps and absurdly addressed, Vernon's fury is directed more at the appearance of the envelope than its contents. "Who'd be writing to you?" sneered Uncle Vernon. But there is no mention of him opening it or asking about its content. This behaviour is not just inconsistent, it is deeply out of character. Vernon Dursley once smashed Harry's door down because he suspected magic was afoot. Petunia, obsessed with appearances and propriety, used to spy through the curtains if she thought Harry was doing anything out of the ordinary. And yet when Harry starts receiving letters from people like Hagrid, a half-giant who once broke down their door with a pink umbrella, they remain surprisingly passive. In Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, Harry is locked in his room after Dobby's disastrous visit. He is deliberately cut off from his magical life. No letters, no school, no friends, but this was done with brute force. Vernon padlocked the door and fed Harry through a flap, reducing him to a prisoner. Still, there is no indication that they were seizing his letters beforehand or afterward. The only time they prevented communication was when they were forcibly detaining him, not through curiosity about what he was writing or receiving, but as a punishment. This absence of interference grows stranger when viewed in the context of Petunia's personal history. She knew about Hogwarts, she knew about Dumbledore. In Order of the Phoenix, it's revealed that she recognized the name of Dementors and even had a vague understanding of their purpose. She had once begged Dumbledore to let her into Hogwarts. Petunia may have hated the magical world, but she had an intimate knowledge of it and deep-seated resentment. Wouldn't someone so emotionally entangled with that world want to monitor her nephew's involvement with it? What's more, the Dursleys were terrified of what magic could do to them. In Goblet of Fire, when the Weasleys arrive through the fireplace and cause destruction, Vernon is not just angry, he is frightened. Petunia, ever obsessed with neatness, is nearly hysterical. They lived in fear of being cursed, hexed, or shamed in front of their neighbours. So why would they allow letters from witches and wizards to pass through their door uninspected? One theory might be that the Dursleys were too afraid to read Harry's letters. Magic, to them, was a foreign and dangerous force. Letters from Hogwarts might be viewed like glowing radioactive scrolls. Better to ignore them than risk contamination. But this explanation falls apart when we remember how much Vernon loves confrontation, especially when it allows him to dominate Harry. He wasn't too afraid to shout at Hagrid, he wasn't too afraid to insult Dumbledore, he wasn't too afraid to forbid Harry from saying the word magic in his house. So why would he be afraid of reading a piece of parchment? A more likely explanation is that the Dursleys saw the letters as a kind of pressure valve. After the events of the first year, they recognized that Harry's time away at Hogwarts worked in their favor. As long as he returned each summer and kept quiet, they could endure the rest. Letting him receive letters might have been a compromise. It gave Harry just enough freedom to keep him from rebelling. This wasn't generosity, it was calculation. A boy who gets letters from friends is less likely to run away. There's also the strange moment in Prisoner of Azkaban when Harry threatens Vernon with Sirius Black's name. Harry uses the fact that he's in touch with someone dangerous to manipulate the Dursleys into treating him better. Vernon's reaction is of pure fear, not just of Sirius, but of the possibility that Harry has powerful allies. If Vernon had been reading the letters, he would have known exactly who Sirius was, but he didn't. He was taken completely by surprise. This moment is crucial because it shows us clearly that the Dursleys weren't monitoring Harry's mail, so the question becomes more pressing. Why not? Perhaps the most subtle answer is that the Dursleys stopped interfering because they were told not to. It's plausible that Dumbledore, in his watchful way, made it known that any interference with Harry's communication would not be tolerated. Petunia receives one howler in Order of the Phoenix, and it shakes her deeply. It's from Dumbledore, one sentence. "Remember my last, Petunia." It freezes her, stops her from kicking Harry out. If a single letter can have that effect, imagine what an earlier, sterner message might have done. Maybe Dumbledore warned her, let the boy communicate or suffer the consequences. This idea gains traction when we remember that Dumbledore was always subtly protecting Harry. Arabella Figg, the batty neighbour who watched Harry in secret, was a squib under Dumbledore's orders. The protection spell that kept Harry safe at Privet Drive was Dumbledore's doing. It would not be out of character for him to have laid down conditions for the Dursleys, conditions that included access to his magical world. And then there's the fear of magical retaliation. In Chamber of Secrets, when Mr. Weasley sends a howler to Ron, it's terrifying. The Dursleys may have heard of such letters. They might have imagined what would happen if one exploded in their living room. They might have thought it safer to leave the letters unopened than risk unleashing something uncontrollable. This idea, though speculative, fits their general mindset. Avoid what they don't understand and pretend it doesn't exist. But despite all these possibilities, the choice to leave Harry's letters untouched remains oddly inconsistent with their broader behavior. They beat Dudley with normalcy and choked Harry with repression. They controlled his meals, his friends, his words, and yet his letters, which could contain instructions, threats, secrets, or worse, were left uninspected. There is even a passage in Half-Blood Prince where Harry receives a letter from Dumbledore announcing his visit to the Dursleys. Vernon is stunned. "Who's Dumbledore?" he asked, cringing slightly. This reaction proves that even after years he has no idea what Dumbledore looks like or how he sounds in a letter. Another piece of evidence that he has never once read the man's correspondence. This makes the Dursleys appear almost lazy in their hatred. Their inaction in this one area feels less like apathy and more like oversight, a narrative gap that doesn't align with the rest of their personalities. J.K. Rowling may have simply chosen not to explore that path in detail, focusing instead on Harry's magical life. But for readers, the discrepancy is hard to ignore. Still, one cannot forget that the Dursleys were cowards at heart. Vernon's bluster hid his terror. Petunia's strictness cloaked her jealousy. And perhaps when it came to magic, they simply chose blindness over risk. Reading the letters might have forced them to understand Harry more. And that was the last thing they wanted. To understand him meant acknowledging that he was part of a world they feared and hated. So they shut their eyes, shut the door, let the letters pass. And in that silence, Harry found his only freedom in the Muggle world. Number 25. Why didn't they use Harry as a lesson for Dudley? Petunia Dursley prided herself on having a perfectly normal family. Her home on Privet Drive was spotless, her curtains pressed, and her son Dudley, as she often boasted, was a darling boy with a healthy appetite and an impressive collection of broken toys. Yet despite the obsessively curated facade of suburban bliss, one thing remained jarringly out of place in the Dursley household: the boy in the cupboard under the stairs. Harry Potter, messy-haired and bespectacled, was more than just an inconvenience. He was a constant reminder of something the Dursleys feared and hated, magic. But for all their hostility toward Harry and all the ways they attempted to suppress his identity, one question lingers like the stench of cabbage in Aunt Petunia's kitchen. Why didn't they use him? It's not uncommon for overindulgent parents to weaponize bad examples as cautionary tales. A misbehaving cousin, a troublemaking neighbor, a failing classmate, these are often turned into symbols of failure to nudge a spoiled child back in line. And Harry, with his ragged clothes, his thin frame, and his mysterious background, was a tailor-made warning sign. He was the anti-Dudley in every conceivable way. But rather than hold him up as a living threat of what happens when you don't behave, the Dursleys seemed determined to isolate the two boys, pretending that Harry's world didn't exist at all. Dudley was never told, "Don't be like Harry." He was never threatened with being sent to a school like Hogwarts. In fact, the very word magic was banned from the household. In Philosopher's Stone, when Hagrid arrives to deliver Harry's letter, Vernon roars, "I will not pay to have some crackpot old fool teach him magic tricks." There's fury in his voice, not just at magic, but at its intrusion into his fortress of normality. The idea of magic is more than just unacceptable, it's taboo. This creates a curious paradox. The Dursleys were terrified of magic, but they didn't use that fear as a parenting tool. They could have easily told Dudley, "If you keep breaking things, you'll end up at a freak school like Harry's." They could have used Hogwarts as a kind of boogeyman institution, a place for failures and oddballs, but they didn't. Instead, they let Dudley grow up in a vacuum, disconnected from the reality of the boy in the cupboard. One possible explanation lies in the depth of Vernon and Petunia's denial. They weren't just repressing magic from their home, they were repressing it from their minds. Petunia especially had once longed for the magical world. Her jealousy of Lily is well documented. In Deathly Hallows, She's quoted recalling her childhood desire to go to Hogwarts, even writing to Dumbledore in desperation. But when that wish was denied, she shut the door on magic forever. Accepting its existence, even in a cautionary context, would be admitting that it had power over her. And Petunia Dursley would never give magic that satisfaction. Vernon, on the other hand, was a man obsessed with appearances. He worked at a drill company and liked things orderly and explainable. Magic, in his view, was anarchy. It defied logic and tampered with reality. If he used Harry as a warning, he'd have to admit that this chaos existed within the very walls of his home. And for Vernon, that was simply too much. It's easier to suppress something than to use it. Easier to hide Harry than to explain him. That's why Harry became invisible, both figuratively and literally. But this decision had consequences. Dudley was allowed to grow up without context, without moral comparison. He became a tyrant in his own household, smashing his way through childhood with fists and tantrums. He hit Harry, he bullied neighbours, and he once punched a child during a school trip to the zoo, actions that were met not with discipline, but with indulgence. Little Tyke wants his money's worth, just like his father. Petunia would coo after Dudley received 37 birthday presents and still demanded more. Had the Dursleys told Dudley, "Behave, or you'll end up like Harry," it would have required them to acknowledge that Harry's life was hard, that he was living in a cupboard, that he was underfed, unloved, and punished for things beyond his control. And that would have opened up another dangerous possibility, that Dudley might start to feel sympathy. And sympathy leads to questions. Why is Harry treated differently? Why is he punished for things I do too? Why do my parents fear him? The Dursleys couldn't risk those questions. The cost of empathy was too high, so they chose ignorance. They built a wall around Dudley, shielding him from the very notion of magic and of consequence. The word wizard was never uttered. The name Hogwarts never passed their lips unless shouted in desperation. Even when letters from the school poured through the mailbox, they were destroyed. At one point, they fled their own home to avoid the truth. As Rowling writes in Philosopher's Stone, no post on Sundays, no blasted letters today. Their efforts to keep Dudley oblivious was so extreme, it bordered on madness. When Hagrid finally arrives to retrieve Harry, Dudley is completely unprepared. He's terrified, not because he understands what magic is, but because he's never been told it existed. He's seen things happen, Harry's hair growing back overnight, a glass pane vanishing at the zoo, but they were dismissed, explained away, or ignored. And so when the truth comes crashing down, it comes not as a cautionary tale, but as a full-blown shock. This approach, total suppression, left Dudley morally blind. He never understood why Harry was punished. He never grasped it that the cupboard was cruel. He only knew that he was the centre of the universe, and Harry was the dust beneath his feet. In the absence of moral contrast, Dudley's cruelty went unchecked, and by the time he finally began to grow, during the events of Order of the Phoenix, when Dementors attack him, he had to learn empathy the hard way. That encounter with the Dementors was a turning point. For the first time, Dudley felt powerless, afraid, exposed, and in that moment, Harry, his lifelong scapegoat, became his saviour. It was the beginning of a slow, painful shift. In Deathly Hallows, we finally see the fruit of that transformation. Dudley offers Harry a cup of tea. It's a small gesture, but monumental in context. "I don't think you're a waste of space," he says, a line that hits harder than any hex. But what if that change had come earlier? What if, instead of hiding Harry's world, the Dursleys had used it as a moral anchor? What if they had said, "See Harry, he's punished because he lies, because he's strange, because he doesn't respect us"? It would have been twisted, yes, but it would have opened the door to understanding. Dudley might have begun to question, and in questioning, he might have grown. There's irony in the fact that the Dursleys had the perfect behavioural tool at their disposal and refused to use it. Parents often rely on fear, be good or else. But in this case, the or else was shoved in a cupboard and told to stay silent. In doing so, the Dursleys not only harmed Harry, they failed Dudley. They left him to navigate childhood without a compass, without the faintest idea of where right and wrong began. One could argue that this was Petunia's plan all along, that by erasing Lily's legacy, by denying magic entirely, she was trying to rewrite her own story. Harry was the living proof that her sister had been special, that Petunia had been left behind. If Dudley had known about magic, he might have asked why he didn't have it, why his cousin could fly on a broom and he couldn't, why his mother trembled at the word wand. Those questions were too dangerous, so Petunia silenced them. She kept her son in the dark to protect herself from the light. It was selfish, but also deeply human. Her fear wasn't just of magic, it was of inadequacy, of being the lesser sister, of raising a son who might one day look at his cousin and see someone to admire, someone magical. And Vernon? His motivations were simpler: control. He didn't care about nuance, he wanted order, rules, respect. And Harry disrupted all of that. A walking violation of everything Vernon believed, so he crushed the boy, but never used him. Because using him meant explaining him. And Vernon Dursley didn't explain himself to anyone. In the end, the tragedy of the Dursleys is not just in their cruelty, but in their cowardice. They could have used Harry as a moral tool, as a warning, as a mirror, but instead they hid him away like a shameful secret. They denied their own son the opportunity to learn from the contrast standing right before him. They raised Dudley in ignorance and called it protection. It was only when magic could no longer be denied, when owls came crashing through windows and giants broke down doors, that the illusion shattered, and by then the damage had already been done. Dudley Dursley grew up blind to the truth, and Harry Potter, the unwanted boy in the cupboard, grew up knowing that silence can be louder than hate. Yet somehow both boys changed. Despite the lies, despite the fear, despite the vacuum of love, Harry found strength, and Dudley eventually found shame. Perhaps that is the most magical transformation of all. Number 26. Why weren't they afraid of Voldemort? It begins not with a storm, but with silence, a silence that clings to number 4, Privet Drive, like ivy on an old brick wall. Within the tidy rooms of this painfully normal home, the most extraordinary secret in the wizarding world quietly breathes behind a cupboard door. The boy with the lightning scar, the one who defied death and lived, eats cold soup while his relatives sip tea in blissful denial. The Dursleys do not speak Voldemort's name, not out of fear, but because, to them, he might as well be a ghost story, if that. One might expect that any rational family, upon learning that their nephew survived an attack from the most feared dark wizard in history, would react with awe, confusion, or at the very least apprehension. But Vernon and Petunia Dursley are not rational in any way that the magical world would recognize. When Albus Dumbledore leaves baby Harry on their doorstep with a letter explaining what has happened, they read it, or perhaps only skim it, and then slam shut both the envelope and their minds. It is not courage that shapes their indifference, but a fierce, almost pathological refusal to allow magic any space in their carefully ordered lives. Petunia Evans Dursley had once peered into that magical world from the outside. As Lily's older sister, she had grown up in the shadow of Hogwarts letters and floating candles, of professors with robes and stern eyes. The bitterness of rejection curdled into scorn. By the time Lily was murdered by Voldemort, Petunia had buried not only her sister's memory, but the entire magical world alongside her. When Harry arrives, a relic of that buried past, Petunia sees not a boy, but a walking reminder of everything she chose to erase. This erasure explains why the Dursleys are not terrified by the name Voldemort. They are not brave, they are blind by choice. They treat the idea of a dark lord like one might treat a foreign dictator. Frightening, perhaps, but far away, contained within a different world. When Professor McGonagall tells Dumbledore that the Muggles will never understand Harry's significance, she is right in more ways than one. These people will never understand him, she says in Philosopher's Stone. And she is not only referring to Harry's gift, but to the very gravity of what surrounds him. Vernon Dursley is a man who values structure, predictability, and the comfort of knowing that everything he controls is contained within the walls of his home and the pages of the Daily Mail. Magic disrupts that order. Voldemort, as the living embodiment of chaos, is therefore something Vernon instinctively discredits. If he acknowledges Voldemort, he must also acknowledge a world in which drills do not matter, in which letters fly through chimneys, and in which his nephew might be something he cannot contain. For Vernon, disbelief becomes a shield, not against danger, but against discomfort. Yet danger is real. When Harry begins to receive letters from Hogwarts, Vernon's response is not curiosity or fear, but rage. He builds stronger walls, isolates Harry further, and flees to a house on a rock in the middle of the sea. But still he does not consider Voldemort. In fact, the name is never once uttered by any of the Dursleys throughout the entire series. Their fear is not of Voldemort's return, but of what Harry represents, the unravelling of their reality. The Dark Lord is less threatening to them than the idea that Harry might become something they cannot tame. One would think that after Hagrid bursts through their door in Philosopher's Stone, after he bends Vernon's gun like a straw and names Voldemort directly, some measure of fear might set in. But even then the Dursleys retreat not into caution but indignation. Petunia shrieks about that awful boy, James, and Vernon insists that Harry will not be going to that school. Their response is not to recognize danger, but to double down on their fantasy of normalcy. It is both absurd and deeply human, the kind of stubbornness that defies logic, and which becomes, over time, a kind of madness. Consider, too, that Voldemort's first downfall brought about an era of peace. When Harry is placed with the Dursleys, Voldemort has vanished. The magical world rejoices, believing the threat to be over. Dumbledore believes that leaving Harry with blood relatives will offer a magical protection against future threats, and in that belief, perhaps he fails to grasp just how completely the Dursleys will wall themselves off from reality. Even as Harry begins to show signs of magic, when he vanishes glass, speaks with snakes, and makes his hair grow back overnight, they respond not with fear of dark forces, but with abuse and suppression. They do not ask why these things happen. They do not ask what else Harry might be capable of. To ask would be to invite the possibility that Voldemort is real, that danger might one day knock again. Instead, they focus all their energy on control. Dudley gets extra portions, Harry gets a cupboard, the illusion is preserved. Later, in Order of the Phoenix, when a pair of Dementors attack Harry and Dudley in Little Whinging, the Dursleys are given their first real brush with the darkness of the wizarding world. And still their response is steeped not in fear of Voldemort, but in irritation. Vernon is angry that the neighbours might talk, that Dudley is acting strangely. When Harry tries to explain, Vernon demands that he clear off. Even the appearance of Dementors, soul-sucking creatures directly linked to Voldemort's return, does not pierce the armour of their denial. What's more, the Dursleys never take steps to protect themselves. They don't move, they don't ask for help. When the Order of the Phoenix escorts them away for their own safety in Deathly Hallows, they go reluctantly, confused and resentful. It is only Dudley who shows a flicker of change, thanking Harry awkwardly. For Vernon and Petunia, their departure is not an escape from danger, but a final annoyance. Voldemort could be standing on their lawn with a wand pointed at their chest, and they might still complain about missing a TV show. And yet, despite their ignorance, they are protected. Dumbledore ensures that as long as Harry calls Privet Drive home, Voldemort cannot touch them there. This protection, ironically, allows them to remain blissfully unaware. They live under a magical shield while insisting that magic does not exist. It is the ultimate paradox. Their safety is guaranteed by the very world they loathe. It's important to remember that the Dursleys are not merely uninterested in Voldemort. They are actively hostile to any mention of him. When Harry dreams of his parents' deaths, when he speaks the name, he is punished. Petunia, in Order of the Phoenix, momentarily reveals that she knows more than she lets on. I heard that awful boy telling her about them years ago, she says. referring to James and Lily discussing Dementors. For a moment, the mask slips. She has heard the name, she knows. But she shoves the truth away as quickly as it comes. This reveals something else. Fear is present, but buried. Not of Voldemort, but of what Voldemort means, of magic, of Lily, of the life she chose and the sister Petunia lost. To acknowledge Voldemort would be to acknowledge grief, and the pettiness of the choice to cut her out. It would mean confronting that Petunia's hatred stems from envy and her denial from pain. There is also a kind of magical racism at play. Vernon especially sees wizards not just as strange, but as lesser. He refers to them with disgust. "Your lot," he says to Harry, as if he was speaking of criminals. Voldemort then becomes just another part of that lot, a criminal among criminals, not a threat to them. He is someone else's problem. Their ignorance is also their weakness. Had Voldemort truly chosen to target the Dursleys, they would have been defenseless. They have no comprehension of what magic can do. They believe locking a letterbox can keep out an owl. They think boarding up a fireplace can stop an invitation from arriving. Their actions betray a childlike logic. If we pretend it's not real, maybe it will go away. Throughout the series, the magical world grows darker. Voldemort returns, the Ministry falls, Muggleborns are hunted. And yet the Dursleys remain untouched until the very end. They are never interrogated, never tortured, never attacked. It's as if Voldemort too considers them irrelevant. They are not worth the trouble, and perhaps that more than anything is the final irony. In their effort to ignore Voldemort, they become invisible. Not just to him, but to the story itself. But readers do not forget. We watch them cling to their delusions while the world burns. We wonder, were they ever afraid? Or was their denial so complete that fear never took root? The answer may lie in a single detail. When Harry tells them that Voldemort has returned, they do not laugh. They do not call him a liar. They say nothing. It is silence again, but this time not the silence of ignorance, the silence of avoidance. Deep down, they know, they always have. It is this knowing and refusing that defines them. They are not brave, not stupid, but something sadder. Ordinary people who choose comfort over truth. And in that choice, they give Voldemort exactly what he wants, a world willing to look away. Number 27, why didn't they demand money for raising Harry? The Dursleys were not kind people, that much was made clear from the first pages of Harry's story. Vernon, with his moustache twitching in disdain, and Petunia, with her bony neck craning to spy on the neighbours, spent their lives ensuring that the world saw them as perfectly normal. They kept their curtains drawn and their secrets buried. Yet for all their selfishness and love of routine, there remains a question so often ignored amid the tales of flying broomsticks and talking hats. Why didn't they ever ask for money? Harry Potter was left on their doorstep like an inconvenient package, a baby swaddled in blankets and sealed with a letter. Albus Dumbledore, a man who should have known better, entrusted the boy to people who had made it their life's mission to pretend that magic didn't exist. And yet Vernon and Petunia accepted him into their home, not out of love or duty, but out of fear, resentment, and perhaps a sense of inevitability. But they never once requested payment for raising him, never demanded a single galleon from the wizarding world that dropped him off and disappeared into the mist. Petunia Dursley, who once longed to be part of the magical world herself, could not feign ignorance forever. She knew enough to fear it. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, when Dumbledore's howler echoed through the living room, "Remember my last Petunia," her reaction was instantaneous. She understood there was a bargain, an unspoken arrangement forged in secrecy and blood magic. But that understanding did not equate to silence out of loyalty. If anything, the Dursleys seemed eager to forget Harry's existence, so why didn't they exploit it? It is not as though they were generous. The cupboard under the stairs, the hand-me-down clothes, the meagre meals, these were not the marks of guardians sacrificing for a child. They resented Harry, and the resentment was laced with economic disdain. Vernon drove a company car, prided himself on his drills, and expected everything in his house to be paid for in hard pounds. And yet when he found out about Hogwarts, he didn't demand a tuition fee be waived. He simply tried to prevent Harry from going. The Dursleys did not act logically when it came to Harry. Logic would have suggested writing to the Ministry of Magic. It would have pointed them toward Gringotts, the wizarding bank where Harry had an inheritance waiting. Gold, enough to live comfortably for years. Vernon, obsessed with appearances, and Petunia, obsessed with control, never tried to access that fortune. Even a simple inquiry could have changed their lives, but the very idea of interacting with the magical world, with its robes and owls and wild unpredictability, was too revolting for them. And here lies the paradox. People obsessed with money ignored a treasure chest. People obsessed with order ignored the opportunity to negotiate a contract. Their hatred for magic was more powerful than their greed. They viewed wizards and witches not as a society to exploit, but as dangerous aberrations. The magical world was a contaminant to be kept out of their suburban lives, not a system to be tapped for profit. Yet it wasn't only hatred that stopped them, it was fear. In the Sorcerer's Stone, Hagrid appears with his wild hair and pink umbrella, blowing down the door to the shack in the sea. He speaks with ease about wizards and goblins, naming schools and banks and spells, and Vernon trembles. He tries to shoot Hagrid, then yells about freaks. That scene captures everything. The deep, irrational fear of a world he cannot control, a world that mocks his reality. Petunia, too, had her moments of revelation. Her bitterness in the Philosopher's Stone was telling. My sister got a letter just like that and disappeared off to that school, and came home every holiday with her pockets full of frog spawn. She was once a girl desperate to be included, then a woman scorned. Her rejection of Harry wasn't just hatred, it was heartbreak curdled into cruelty. She didn't want compensation from a world that had already chosen her sister over her. Still, their silence about money is more than just fear. It reflects a boundary drawn in blood. Dumbledore's letter, left with baby Harry, was not merely a request. It was a magical contract. As long as Harry could call the Dursleys' house home, he would be protected by the ancient enchantment sealed through his mother's sacrifice. The Dursleys, in their own twisted way, were custodians of that magic, however unknowingly. Perhaps Dumbledore's letter did more than explain. It warned. It's not unthinkable that Dumbledore put enchantments on the letter itself, spells that would influence their decision, press upon their minds, shape their behavior without them realizing it. This was, after all, a man who saw the future in fragments and played the long game. He needed Harry to survive. And if manipulating the minds of Vernon and Petunia was the cost, so be it. In The Half-Blood Prince, we see how calculating Dumbledore could be, manipulating even Tom Riddle's memories to teach Harry what he needed to know. The idea that he subtly charmed the Dursleys is not far-fetched. Even without such spells, there is the likelihood that Dumbledore leveraged something else entirely. Shame. Petunia, after all, was Lily's sister. Her hatred may have been real, but so was her guilt. Dumbledore's reminder, "Remember my last," sent a shiver of dread through her. She knew something the others didn't. Perhaps she had received a letter long ago, back when Lily died. Perhaps she had been told what would happen if she turned Harry away. And perhaps she knew that asking for money would jeopardize it all. Then again, there's the possibility that they simply didn't know. The Dursleys may never have known about Harry's vault at Gringotts. They never visited Diagon Alley, never asked questions, never investigated, but that seems unlikely. By Harry's second year, they were aware of magic, of the bank, of the school, and still they did nothing. Petunia, with her obsession for detail and spying, must have pieced something together. She surely overheard enough to suspect. And still, they stayed silent.